What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show.
So one thing that Lou Elizondo told me, and that he's told this to other people, and he said it in the show Unidentified, one of the biggest things, surprisingly, that he ran into with opposition within the Pentagon, within the Defense Department to the work that he was doing, is that there was a very large contingent of people that believed that this was a demonic force, as in demons, and that we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be investigating it. We shouldn't be poking the tiger in the eye.
They thought the phenomenon that was being witnessed was demons?
Yes, within the military establishment, within the Pentagon, within DOD, there was a large number of people that opposed his work because they thought from a very, very fundamentalist viewpoint that we're dealing with demonic activity.
Ron, you ever see aliens out in Arizona? You ever
No.
look out in the desert and just see a UFO floating right there and give your life some meaning?
I'm camped out in Sedona right now, right? And I've lived there off and on for going on 10 years spread apart. It's supposed to be one of the most relevant UFO hotspots anywhere in the world.
Really?
And I still haven't seen a UFO, even in Sedona. And I lived for years right on the ocean overlooking Catalina Island. Another UFO hotspot.
Didn't they film something there
They
recently?
did, yeah. Carolyn Corey did A Tear in the Sky, where she brought in a bunch of people, and they used these cameras to triangulate, and they supposedly found a bunch of stuff coming up out of the water. Pretty compelling evidence. I lived there for the longest time. I never saw anything. I brought Ed Grimsley, the guy that used to do, he was the guy that invented the idea of using night vision goggles to find UFOs. I brought him there with another guy, the UFO summoner that supposedly could call UFOs. No, this guy was for real. He would.
Are we sure?
He would. Well, I don't mean for real like that. This guy, what was his name? I can't remember. But he calls himself the UFO summoner, and he would go to parks in downtown LA on the weekend, and he would gather crowds, and they would all summon UFOs, and you'd see these UFOs flying through the skies of downtown Los Angeles, and he'd have these pictures in his little picture book, and he would say, yeah, these are all UFOs. And I'm like, well, it's a Sunday morning in downtown Los Angeles, and these look an awful lot like birthday balloons. In fact, that one looks like a 14. And he'd say, well, they don't want you to know they're UFOs. And I'm like, so, okay, this is a real conversation. I'm like, okay, please explain this to me. You're saying that they're UFOs, but they look like Mylar balloons because they don't want us to know they're UFOs, but they want us to know they're here. And when you call them, they're coming. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's the contradiction right there.
So I've actually had some of these people on my properties on overlooking the ocean. The reason I'm using two hands is because one time I had one in Laguna Beach, and another time I had one right on the ocean in San Pedro. And both times we did all kinds of experiments trying to get UFOs and photograph them, and I did not have any luck at all.
Have you ever, I mean, we've heard certain patterns with UFOs over time. One of my favorite topics to just like think about is the whole like nuclear part of it and going over nuclear bases. That's very interesting and very compelling around the world when you look at those reported sightings, not just here, but in Russia and other countries. But when it's not something like that and it's things like the desert or certain parts of the world, do you ever find yourself putting together exactly why they may go to certain places?
Well, you think about it a certain amount of time. Certainly there's a reason that you could ascertain for why they're interested in nuclear sites. The Rendlesham Forest thing even was supposedly, it's still classified, but supposedly there was nuclear weapons on that base. And then you have the stuff with Robert Salas and Faded Giant, which was a real thing. And then of course Roswell was supposedly, that was the Army airfield where the Enola Gay was headquartered.
Yeah.
So that's where the first nuclear bombs were actually launched and deployed. So there's and it makes some sense that they'd be interested in our weapons, but then, why they show up at other places, there's no real way to have a consistent kind of theory as to why that happens. Because for one thing, there could be things going on with the Earth that we don't know. So, we know about things like ley lines, and we know about that are theoretical. We know about energetic power grids, theoretical, but they could be real. And there could be reasons in different spots on the Earth where these places interact, where there's, walls of dimensions that are thinner that we just don't even know about.
Walls of dimensions that are thinner.
Yeah, well, think about this.
Okay. I'm thinking.
There's an energetic fabric that basically is matter. It's all basically energy vibrating at a certain frequency to give us the illusion of matter. There's theories of multiple dimensions. Mm-hmm. It stands to reason when people talk about portals. Well, what does that even mean? What's a portal, right? They talk about it at Skinwalker Ranch. You see scientists talk about it. You see people that don't even know anything about any kind of science talking about there being portals. Well, what is that? That is a place, theoretically, where you're going to see energy that divides different realms be thinner. And so there's that could be going on. We don't know about it. We don't have the science to prove it yet. But there could be a lot of reasons why you see quote unquote UFO hotspots where the reason they're hotspots is not apparent to us.
That's my issue with the entire phenomenon in and of itself. We don't know how these civilizations would think. Something as simple as like the Wawa down the street could be the thing for some reason that has like their holy grail that they want to look for. And we'd never know why, because they're like, obviously, Dr. Kaku and some of the things he talks about with these different types of civilizations, type 0, 1, 2, 3.
Sure.
To get all the way to a 3, which he said would take, I want to say that one was like another 100,000 years for us or some shit.
I think it's even longer than that.
So either way, think about the power of human ingenuity across, 8, 10, 12, 15 billion people as the population grows just to be able to get there, and how much more they would know. We'd have trouble having a conversation with people from 150 years ago. What do you think we'd do with people, when it's 100,000 years from now or something, So that's the one part where I'm like, how can we really even concept it? Like the nuclear bombs one, that makes a ton of sense. But the other things, like, we're just kind of guessing, no?
We're guessing in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And, you brought something up that would be really kind of a big let the air out of the tire kind of moment. We have this perception of self-importance. Like maybe the aliens are coming here because they have some interest in us. Or maybe they're coming here because, they want to nurture us into a galactic family. Or maybe they're coming here because we're some kind of experiment. But to find out in the long run that some alien was able to see into the future and realize that there was going to be a wahoo and they're only coming here for the sandwiches, that would suck.
Yeah. The thing about the whole interest argument, though, like you and I were talking shortly before we got on cam, joking about Neil deGrasse Tyson and like what he said about that, where he's like, oh, they wouldn't have any interest in us. I mean, I guess technically, like, you can't prove for a fact that he's wrong, but I don't agree that we wouldn't be interesting. And this is where it can kind of finger off into a lot of different rivers of possibilities here. Like if we looked at our planet and were able to figure out, for example, just throwing this out there, that like, ooh, we're a simulation. Well, then if we're a simulation, the whole point of it is to be interested in us.
Right.
Things like that. I mean, that means it's like they created The Sims and we're The Sims,
Yeah, the difference between living in a simulated reality and us actually being Sims is that there are outside forces that control the Sims. Like us with our computers, we're just manipulating them like puppets. And so even though I'm kind of a subscriber to the idea that this is some kind of a simulation, I'm not sure that we're manipulated puppets. But we might be, and we don't know. The whole thing about AI, like in movies like Blade Runner and what we're seeing with emerging AI, is that we have these artificially created beings, real or from fiction, that don't know they're artificially created. And and more that seems like it's coming out, where you can create what we would call an artificial intelligence, but that doesn't mean that it is going to perceive itself as artificial. It will think that it's alive, And so maybe if we are artificial thinking that we're alive, it all boils down to why. What's the purpose? Sure, we could be in a simulation. Sure, there could be aliens. Sure, all of this could be something that we don't even understand, but there's got to be a reason for it. And ultimately, that's the ultimate answer, is what is the reason for all of this, whatever it is.
Well, that's the elusive question that we'll be lucky if we ever get to 0.000000001% of it. It's like, I'm obsessed with the idea of Einstein thinking he could find the theory of everything. I think it was such a noble thing as well, and obviously genius scientists contributed a ton to the world. But like, if you could actually like read the mind of God like that, whatever it or that is, think about. Like, we can't even concept the numbers of dimensions it would take to even get there. We may not even have a concept of what that number is. Like, we say trillion and we think that's like an insane number. That could be like 0.0001 of what it really is, because numbers are infinite. Like, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night, not even like when I'm high or some shit. I'm just like, oh.
Me too. And it's true that Einstein was after the theory of everything, right? I mean, he died with paperwork and formulas on his desk. And the theory of everything as it relates to physics, as you know, is basically, let's come up with a mathematical formula that explains how reality works. How the physical universe works, how the laws of physics works, how everything clicks. And the reason they can't find one that's cohesive, and this is my opinion, but I've done a lot of research on this. I'm not a scientist. I think one of the last people you had here was Kaku. But so I don't want to sit in Dr. Kaku's chair and act like I know anything about physics. But it has been proven that physics cheats. If a feat needs to be accomplished that does not fit within the laws of physics, it has ways of sidestepping the laws of physics to accomplish a task in the real world. And I could tell you an example of that.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
Actually, I thought I knew what you were saying, and now I'm hearing that. Maybe I don't. Please give an example.
Okay, so there's this thing called quantum photosynthesis.
Yes.
Okay, this is a scientifically proven thing. For years, scientists couldn't figure out why a plant was able to find the most efficient route for that photon to get to the root where it's turned into energy that grows the plant. Out of all the ways that a photon could pass through this plant, it always, if you track the photon, would find the most efficient route through the plant. What they came to discover is that this plant was collapsing into a quantum state where it sent the photon on all possible routes through the plant, then collapsed back into the physical reality and took the most logical route.
Yes.
So basically what it's doing is it's sidestepping the laws of physics, going into a quantum state outside the laws of physics to determine its best possible way of executing the task within physical reality. So what that's proving to us is that stuff can cheat. So it's impossible to find a theory of everything, because a theory of everything has to be, this is how it works 100% of the time, and we can prove it with algorithms. But if the very way that reality works enables it to do things outside of any rules, then you can't come up with a theory of everything, because you can never estimate the extent to which it can break its own rules. And quantum photosynthesis shows us that it's possible and that it's probably happening.
This might be a really dumb take, what I'm about to say, but I'm just trying to synthesize all this, no pun intended. If everything is infinite, including shrinkage, meaning like we have string theory that says it's like the smallest form of matter we've ever discovered, but we still have to test it. Well, below the strings, there has to be something below that. Microscopic to the microscopic,
right?
If you catch my drift. So when you're talking about the theory of everything, it's only based off of things that we've at least concepted before. When even like quantum itself, like the photosynthesis,
it's a word that gets tossed around a lot, but not that many people really understand what
exactly.
it means.
And like I don't even pretend to have a full understanding at all. And I've talked with people like Dr. Kaku who've written books on it. It's like, do you believe in God?
Well, I believe in the God of Einstein. He believed in God, but not the God that intervenes in human affairs. It was the God of order, the God of simplicity and elegance. Einstein was asked the question, did the universe have a choice? Is it unique? So universes, you can create universes in an afternoon, but most of them are unstable. Most of them fall apart. Most of them don't work. Our universe is stable. It works. Everything fits together. And then the question is, what set off the bang? That's what we do for a living. We have the Big Bang Theory up to the point where the universe is going to explode. Why did it explode? We think it was a quantum event, and we are here because we are in the universe which decided to explode. So Einstein said, was it all an accident? And he thought, no, it could not have been an accident.
To me, I'm up at night. I'm like, I still don't really, like, I get it at the atomic level, but like all this shit. But on the photosynthesis thing, it's like if that process is happening and the way that it I'm saying this in really layman's terms, but the way that it spreads around so quickly to be able to process it through the entire plant exists, and it definitely does, at something way smaller at the microscopic level that we've never even concepted before, then we don't have anywhere close to the information, just the way I'm reading it as a layman, to be able to say what everything is if we can't even measure the things that make up the everything.
Exactly. And as like one of my friends, John Alexander, said, we're not at the stage where we're asking the right questions yet. And so what I'm saying,
the general?
Colonel.
Colonel,
But what I'm saying is that in order to have a theory of everything that explains how physics works, how the universe works, how it came into existence, we have to know a lot more than we know. And that's why this has been so elusive. It's like E equals MC squared. This little 4-5 line formula was supposed to explain everything, but it doesn't. And people, scientists, our best scientists are trying to come up with this thing, this simple mathematical algorithm that explains everything. And I don't think that it's possible because you can't take randomness into effect when you're trying to come up with a definitive formula.
Now, I could bite that off for a while. We could go right down that rabbit hole. But for people listening right now who haven't heard of you before or know what you've done,
that's a heck of a way to start a conversation.
That was a great opener.
I mean, I will not do that in a bar. It's like, hey, babe, got a minute to talk about the theory of everything? This is my number, though. It's not a formula.
No, you got to direct them to your documentary. But you recently came out with a great film, highly informational, called Accidental Truth. And how long did you work on this? This had to be like 5-6 years, right?
Well, the film itself took me about 1.5 years to edit.
Yes.
And some of the interviews that came out in it weren't even shot before I actually started the film. But the actual material, some of it goes back to 2007 when I first interviewed some of these people.
Oh, some of it goes all the way back to 2007. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Like I've interviewed Nick Pope like 3 or 4 times, and the first one was in, I think, 2008.
And for people out there, who is he?
Nick Pope is a former British Ministry of Defense UFO desk guy. When I was growing up, he used to write a column for UFO magazine, and I was like, "Wow, here's this government guy, talking to the community," and I thought that was pretty cool. And and so here we are all these years later.
Yeah. So you obviously had an interest in this for a long time, but in your doc, which I'll put the link in the description for everyone to go buy it and check it out. I definitely recommend it. But in your doc, you went at it from all different types of angles. I like this. It reminded me, as far as like the number of angles, it was reminiscent of the phenomenon, which our mutual friend James Fox did.
Oh, yeah.
It almost seems like they're watching us, like a god a little bit, if this is the case, to make sure we don't destroy ourselves.
So I interviewed a number of eyewitnesses regarding that aspect of the phenomenon, and that is particularly during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. They are witnessed in Russia and all scattered across the United States. And this launch control officer, Robert Salas, I'll never forget this. He said, "Well, James, the message I got when they shut our nukes off, it's almost like they were taking matches out of the hands of a baby."
But I'm fascinated at the fact that there are now so many of these people who are talking, be it the Lou Elizondos, the Chris Mellons, some of the colonels and generals you've spoken to, who have kind of come out in recent years and started to talk about the phenomenon. And, my little red light sensor goes up right away and goes, aha, like
sure.
What's the agenda here? But when you're going into this and making the documentary, are you suspicious of that at all? Or do you trust the information you're going to be getting from them because you're sitting right across from them and you feel like you could get a read for it?
That's interesting because at the very beginning of the documentary, the only time you really see or hear much of me is because Matthew Modine narrates it, which is great. But at the very beginning, I say something like, I'm sitting in these rooms alone with people that have run secret weapons programs, interrogated terrorists, protected closely guarded secrets for a living. And all I can think about is getting them to tell me something they don't want me to know. And at the end of the day, that's pretty much every interview that I walked into where I knew that I was dealing with somebody like that, that was in the back of my mind. And I would ask questions designed to try to get some kind of information out of them that was beyond what they're actually willing to say with their words.
Guys, the Julian Dory Podcast Fashion Collection is officially live, so hit that link in the description below. Go get your gear just like this and show off your favorite show to all your friends. Let's get it!
And that's what Accidental Truth is about. I successfully did that with Elizondo. I did it with Christopher Mellon. Gary Nolan.
Can you explain to people who don't know? A lot of people listening absolutely will know, but for those who aren't as familiar with ufology and things, who is Lou Elizondo?
So Lou Elizondo is in 2017, the New York Times broke that story about the Navy studying UFOs, and that was a guy named Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Keene, and there was another, I can't remember her name, there was another writer that helped break that story, and I apologize to her for not getting it. But that was a story that came out and said, yes, the military's been studying UFOs since 2004 or slightly before that, and we've been seeing things that we can't describe. And Lou Elizondo came out as a guy who was actually running that program, which
called ATIP?
They called it ATIP. There's a lot of controversy around that, but my investigations have revealed that it's pretty much what he says is true as far as this pipeline of info. But Lou Elizondo ran that program and came out on 60 Minutes saying, we might not be alone. And that was the first time.
Fed.
Yeah, that was, exactly. Yeah. Serving the agenda. But, now the agenda is to admit that we might not be alone.
I love when he like pauses and he's like, if I say something else, I may say something I'm not allowed to say. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, all right, Lou, we get it.
I mean, but the thing is that I think that there's three layers to all this. The first layer is that there are people, and they're very few and far between, who have the big picture as far as what's happening with humankind's interaction with non-human intelligence. And those guys have been in the shadows since the 40s and even probably further back than that. Now, those guys, we're probably never going to know who they are. And with generational stuff, with lack of institutional memory, they may not even know who they were originally. A lot of this information people think is in some big vault somewhere. And my investigations have revealed that these guys have no problem destroying evidence, and that there could very well, at this point in time, not be anybody that is in possession of the cohesive story and the evidence chain going all the way back to the 40s.
What do you mean? Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, which part?
You're saying that like the government. Like, I have a hard time believing that with even the biggest secrets of mankind that maybe multiple governments are working on, I have a hard time believing that any evidence would be completely destroyed.
Well, we found plenty of evidence that that's the case.
But is it tertiary evidence to something that they don't destroy the evidence for, that therefore is actually the center of it, and they just kind of destroy a few documents that might get people on the right path?
Well, it's more like, at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark when they go and there's this big warehouse where everything's stored.
Yes.
Okay, there might be a warehouse like that where, quote unquote, everything is stored. But there might not be very many people who know exactly where it is and what's in it.
Well, that's the other thing. How do they even decide for something like that? Like, if we're talking about the nature of being joined in our universe, which could be like the greatest national security risk ever,
right?
Potentially. How do you even decide who's a need to know? Like, doesn't that change even? Like, it doesn't mean like every CIA director, like, yeah, we'll tell this one. There might be some where they're like, no, like, we're not telling. And who decides?
Well, we have evidence that happened, and that presidents at some point quit being read in, supposedly right after Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton couldn't get to the information. Obama tried not as hard, but he couldn't get to the information. Trump couldn't get to the information. But Reagan was pretty much read in, and the Bushes are supposedly some of the people that shepherded that transition from what body politic are we going to inform and not inform.
How do we know that, by the way?
There's a lot of historical references to Bush and UFOs, and historical references to, Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld. These guys were like the suspicious movers and shakers in Washington before we had suspicious movers and shakers in Washington. These guys were pulling stuff back in the day that now would be like, oh my God, that's a scandal, and we'd be surprised. But don't be surprised. These guys These guys had DC wired and government wired for all kinds of stuff way before we even knew that there was these kind of games being played. And Bush, with his, he was the head of the CIA. He will say, well, he's gone now, but he would say, yeah, I know about this stuff, but I'm never going to talk about it. And so, and this is what I mean. We have one of the things we point out in Accidental Truth is that there is a history of exactly what we're being told today, being told to us in the 50s, almost verbatim. It's like they couldn't even afford a new screenwriter. We have the head of the Air Force coming out and saying, yes, we're witnessing these craft and they're not ours. And then in the film, we flash forward to Lou Elizondo. Yes, we're witnessing these craft and they're not ours. We're committed to getting to the bottom of it, they said in the 50s. Then at the Senate hearings on UFOs, they're committed to getting to the bottom of it. Then back to the 50s, General Sanford saying that they're going to start a massive investigation and that they're going to identify whether or not it's a threat. Then fast forward to the Senate hearing where the Moultrie, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, says, yes, we're committed to getting to the bottom of it. And this is a 70-year difference. Yeah. Okay, so the idea that at one point there was a group like MJ-12, maybe, a group like it, if not that group.
MJ-12? I don't think I'm familiar with that.
So the story is that back in the 40s, Eisenhower put together a group, and they called it Majestic 12. And the names of these people are they're historically documented, and there's supposedly these papers that came out describing that they were tasked with taking the whole UFO thing and managing the information and sequestering it away and managing, which involved burying it to the point where nobody was accountable. So they created this whole organization. Now, people will debate the existence of MJ-12. It's a hotly debated subject. The papers that came out are, people still to this day debate their authenticity. But it makes sense that if you're the government in the 40s and 50s and you've got evidence of something that you don't understand that's crashed, you're going to put together at the highest level a group of scientists and military people and intelligence people to look at this and manage it and decide how to disperse it to the public, if at all. So if there wasn't an MJ-12, a simple thought experiment would lead you to the point where there must have been somebody. Because you don't have a craft of unknown origins crash in the desert and then you just don't look into it.
Yeah, and it has to be, like, my thought, I think, is in line with most people's thoughts. Like, it has to be something like an amalgamation. It has to be something separate. It's not like, oh, the CIA's on this, or like, oh, the NSA's on this. Like, there has to, I'm not saying that there aren't people in those organizations who are like read in and a part of it. In fact, I'll bet that literally is the case.
That's pretty much describing what I've been able to find out.
Right? So it has to be some sort of like group of individuals that are that are clear to be read in on this and work in tandem together secretly. And, covering up secrets like this, that's something that's really hard for me to concept because I can't imagine having that information.
So you got Roswell. The Roswell Daily Record spills the story, General Ramey, or flying saucer. Then the next day, it was a weather balloon. Okay, there was a group that was responsible for that about face, and was responsible for that whole story changing and being buried, and all whatever was found at Roswell, whether it was alien or whatever, we never saw it. The weather balloon is pretty much debunked completely. So, an organization formed to do that. The first thing they decided was that, well, we can't go public with this, so we've got to keep it a secret. So now these guys have free reign in the early days of government to do whatever. They're accountable to nobody except the president. And their job is figure out what to do with this information, figure out what to do with the stuff we've recovered. And their decision was, we can't tell the public for any number of reasons. And now we got to look into this technology. And so it didn't go to the front-facing military. It didn't go to the halls of Congress, although a lot of people say some of it ended up in the basement, maybe. It went into top secret rooms where they had conversations about, hey, we found this. Can you look into what that might be? And it could be everything from an intact craft to a piece of technology to a piece of metal to a piece of materials. Any of those things. So over time, with zero accountability, lots of black budget money, and compartmentalization where very few people knew the whole picture. So you could be a colonel. Let's say somebody's sitting on top of this whole thing, and they know the entire story. They're the ones that put this group together. How many of those people are there? Not many.
No.
3 or 4. You're called into these guys' office and you're handed a piece of something and you're told to take it to Lockheed Martin. So you take it to Lockheed Martin. Now, how many people in that chain know anything about where this stuff came from that is provable? Nobody. Now, you fast forward 50 years when these guys are all gone and all that remains is the remnants of these programs and legends about where this stuff came from. Is there some kind of repository where all these records are kept? Maybe, but who knows where it is?
See, I don't know where the line gets drawn. That's the other problem here. Like, where is it? Where do these individuals, whoever they are, figure out that, hey, anything at any point, even in the future, like let's say they're saying even 300 years from now or something like that, anything past this line, we can never talk about. What makes them decide that? To me, this is just where my head goes, not to go like too far with it, but it means they're here and they've been here. And it's the kind of thing where if we actually had the information shared with the public, people would riot in the streets or kill themselves or whatever they're going to do because it means it's like the end times are here. That's the only thing I can come up with that makes sense. And then when you start to think that, you're like, well, am I a crazy person too? I don't think so, but other people could say that, you know?
Well, the idea that there's been some kind of presence of a non-human or even alternative human species here on the planet that we don't know about, that's pretty much not hard to dismiss, that they've been here through all of recorded history. In Accidental Truth, we have a guy that has come forward in the film for the first time ever admitting that he was running 30 and 40 years ago a secret government program studying this stuff.
Who was this guy?
Alexander in the film. Mm-hmm. And he talks about how that these things have been with us for all of recorded history and that flying saucers are absolutely real and that our sensors picked them up from time to time up to a mile wide, he said that he's seen.
I think I had him mixed up. Who was the guy who was, because you and I talked about this last night, who was the guy who was basically just a middleman though? Like
well, I think that was Alexander. I think that there was in the time when he came in, and Colonel John Alexander, for people who don't know, he was involved in a lot of esoteric government programs. They studied life after death. They studied non-lethal weapons technology, mind control. He was supposedly involved in what was that program that they did where they were doing mind control experiments on people?
MK Ultra.
Yeah, he was involved in MK Ultra.
He was the guy who was like the subject of Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yeah, they made that movie, and he was Kevin Spacey's character supposedly was after him. And he was also fictionalized in a book called Out There by a New York Times writer. But at any rate, Alexander's military record, what we do know and can prove, this guy was ultimately, if there was ever a guy that could tell you, but he'd have to kill you, it might have been John. And for years, he would say that, there's no government program studying UFOs. In recent time, he's come out and said, well, that's not exactly true. There was, and I was actually running one of them. And we've been able to find this evidence. But he will tell you, and he does in the movie, maybe for the first time ever, that we've been studying these things for a long time. And the stuff that Lou Elizondo's group found, and he says this too in the film, they were studying craft doing the exact same thing 30, 40 years ago. And it's the same group that has surfaced through TTSA, the Hal Puthoffs, the people like that came up through Tom DeLonge's organization in 2017. These are the same guys that have been involved in these programs going all the way back 30, 40 years.
What's that called? To the Stars?
To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences. Okay. But back to the original question as to how this stuff could get sequestered. After a while, nobody knows the whole story. The classified documents have been either filed away where nobody knows where they're at or destroyed. The reason that the information is not getting out, if you give something, say just a military officer went to Lockheed Martin with some material that is non-earthly or of unknown origin and said, see what this is, what you can do with it. Well, Lockheed goes, oh, wow, this stuff causes, if you bend it just right, you can have invisibility, or if you do this with it, you can defy radar, or, look at this stuff. You can crinkle it up and it folds back out to its original shape. Let's figure that out. Well, now all of a sudden you've got something that a corporation is in possession of that becomes a trade secret that they are not going to share with anybody. And so there's a lot of reason to believe that a whole bunch of stuff ended up in that category. And it's free from Freedom of Information Act requests. It's free from the prying eyes of the public.
But the government they don't care about that, right?
Well, it's kind of like a government industry partnership.
Yeah, but
See, no longer is the government accountable for this. Once it goes into the private corporation, it goes from a classified program into a corporation. There's no Freedom of Information Act accountability. There's nothing.
Okay. All right.
And so now this has been the whole stuff about crash debris retrievals and analysis and back engineering research. That is all in compartments and stovepipes throughout a huge amount of companies that are accountable not to the public at all. And the fact that these programs even exist has been covered up at the deepest levels because these guys that started all this within government were accountable to nobody in the very beginning. And over time, they've been given so much money and so much black budget money and so much lack of accountability that we have no idea what's going on. And the idea that there's somebody sitting on top of all this right now that knows everything about everything UFO related in some secret office in the basement of the Pentagon, I used to think that that was probably true, and now I'm not so sure.
Why aren't you sure?
There was rumors of something called the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Oh, yes. Please explain this.
So supposedly the Blue Room was this room down in the basement of one of these hangars where they stored all the stuff that, like from Roswell and alien technology and even bodies. And it was rumored to be a thing for a long time.
Where is that base? Wright-Patterson
in Ohio.
It's called?
Yeah, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Okay. It's basically pretty much acknowledged as being the place where a lot of this stuff ended up. But through a variety of evidence and stories and documents and everything else. Barry Goldwater, the senator, tried to investigate this, and he called Curtis LeMay, who ran Wright-Patterson at the time, and asked him about the Blue Room and got chewed out and said, never ask me about this again. So a lot of people were like, okay, well, we want to find this film from the Blue Room. So there was a few years ago, it's been like 20 years since this happened, but it did happen and it's documented. Extensive Freedom of Information Act requests about the Blue Room and the film. The existence of this film was denied across the board. But finally, somebody asked the right questions and got it to the right department within the Air Force, who returned a Freedom of Information Act request that documented that there was a film of the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Base with a project number, a media number assigned to it, that was actually shot of the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and was destroyed. Now, if that film was truly destroyed, that's an example of the fact that these guys have no problem just absolutely destroying evidence. If it was supposedly destroyed and it's sitting in a room somewhere and it was never destroyed, that's a different story. But there seems to be a propensity and a willingness by the government and the military. There's plenty of public records of the military going into a place where something happened and just destroying the evidence. And if they've they've destroyed the evidence of these craft and these interactions, I used to think that's impossible. They couldn't have done that. Who would do that? But I kind of like, well, maybe they have in some cases.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if it's like they're burning the test files, saying, "Oh, look at us burning all this shit. I guess it's all gone."
Yeah,
and it's really somewhere else. Like, it fascinates me.
I hope that's the case. I really do.
I do too, but it's still like a little sinister.
It's very sinister. This whole thing is sinister.
Yes.
I mean, it's like when I first got into doing stuff in the UFO field, it was because I was hired to video, because I own a production company. I was hired to go in and shoot and live stream a UFO conference back in 2007.
Oh, that's how you got into it.
So I got into the UFO thing.
No shit.
Legitimately, yeah. I mean, I've always had an interest.
Okay, so this is something you had at least thought about.
Yeah, I read the magazines, I watched the shows. I read Eric von Daniken's epic Ancient Astronauts. that was the movie that broke the ice for everything. It's still to this day one of the best-selling books of all time and one of the biggest movies. But Chariots of the Gods. But yeah, I got hired to do this thing, and I started watching these people parading around. It's where I interviewed Edgar Mitchell for the first time. It's where I interviewed John Alexander for the first time, Nick Pope for the first time. This is around 2007. And I got the bug. I'm like, wait a minute. This is the biggest falsehood, the biggest deception being perpetrated on humanity ever. And, as a journalist and as a video person and somebody that likes to dig for answers, I was hooked. And I've been investigating this for years, ever since. And I've been interviewing people. I have drawers of hard drives, probably well over 150 hard drives.
I'm going to tell you, I'm going to cut you off right there. I'm going to tell you the same thing I told James Fox, and I'm working on him about this all the time. But for you guys who have been doing this for a while and have sat on camera with all these brilliant people for so many years, again, you make a documentary, you got to cut it to 90 to 120 minutes, something like that. All this stuff stays on the cutting floor. And you guys got to do the PBS Frontline treatment, where when they do these docs, they then have a separate channel where they post the raw interviews with all the people. You guys got to do that.
Well,
because the
I've
gold
done that.
You got to have in there is crazy.
So when I made I made something called the Disclosure Dialogues back in 2010, and it won all the awards at the time. It was basically, there was dialogues on disclosure with a feature movie called It Could Happen Tomorrow. And then it was a 5-disc set, and the other 5 discs on the set, the other 4 discs, were all the full-length interviews with the people.
All right, we need this from everything you've done since then. We got to make a YouTube channel strictly for it.
Well, there's Accidental Truth, the new documentary,
Yes.
that has literally 40 hours of interviews behind what is ultimately an 89-minute film. So there's the website inside of MUFON Television, called AT Insider, Accidental Truth Insider, where all of that stuff is being published.
Okay.
So, like Congressman Tim Burchett is in Accidental Truth saying some really cool stuff. But there's the interview with him was over an hour, and I went to his office and I set up multiple cameras. Something that nobody's seen yet, because I haven't put it out, is me sitting in his office for the first part of the interview, lining him out on everything we know from the Roswell incident all the way up until now. I'm sitting in a sitting congressperson's office with multiple cameras telling him the whole UFO story, that nobody's ever done that. And so that's going to be one of the behind-the-scenes things that people can access.
What was his involvement again? Like, what committee is he on?
What happened with Tim, he's always been kind of into the topic. There's a lot of people in government, we think that we have some kind of separation from them, but they're people just like us.
Yeah.
And he's always been interested
He's
in that.
not that high. He's a congressman.
And he's he's a representative, which is, he'll tell you in his office is like, I'm low man on the totem pole.
Right.
But he's a really good guy, down to earth.
He's like a big God guy too, right?
Yeah, he's
But
very
into aliens.
religious. Yeah, he one of the talks that we had, my conversation with Tim Burchett, was that he's one of those Christian fundamentalists who does not believe that the idea of life in outer space and even aliens visiting the Earth interferes with their belief system. A lot of them do believe that and will staunchly deny it for that sake, but Tim's pretty open-minded about that. But what happened is one day he was just crossing the street and he got hit up by TMZ, and it was the UFO things were big in the news. And Tim made a comment like, yeah, it's just a big cover up. More people believe in aliens than believe in Congress. And he walked off. And all of a sudden, that was it for Tim. He was now the UFO Congress guy. And so if you go to his website, you could buy the T-shirt. It's pretty funny. But that's how it was totally just happenstance.
Wow.
Happenstance that he got kind of thrust into the mainstream talking about this stuff. But he understands. And I've talked to... 3 months ago, I had lunch with Andre Carson, the senator, the
Yes.
representative that ran that hearing. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later.
How'd you get hooked up with him?
Well, I work with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. We're the oldest and largest organization studying the topic. We have lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And
MUFON.
What a lot of people don't know is that we've been behind the scenes in D.C., including some work by Dave McDonald, the director, Jessica Taco, who owns the lobbying firm A10 and Associates that work for us. We've been in D.C. for about 2 years now, softening everybody up over this disclosure thing. And while there's a lot of people out there talking about it, like, oh, yes, I've been in Washington, D.C. doing this, this, and this, we've been there, and we have the proof of it. The hearing that they did with Andre Carson and Mike Gillibrand, or I'm sorry, Mike Gallagher, we were instrumental in getting those hearings done. We're the ones who talked Andre Carson into having those hearings in the first place. That was us. And so the reason I was having lunch with Andre Carson is because I was introduced to him by the lobbying firm, and a bunch of people from MUFON went up to D.C., and we met with a lot of sitting congressmen. And so I actually sat down with Andre, sat right next to him for over an hour, and I laid it out for him too. And I told him about the movie, because he's in the movie. And he's basically portrayed as one of those people who's towing the line for the news story.
Yes.
And so I kind of had to break that to him. I'm like, well, you're in the film, and we're pointing out that you're supporting the new
You're not
narrative.
Great.
Yeah. So anyway, he went home and watched it, and there's really been no blowback from anybody in the film, even though a lot of them are getting kind of caught saying stuff that they shouldn't say.
What did he say, without revealing confidences or things like that, off the record stuff? Like, what was your take sitting with him for an hour and hearing him talk about the subject matter? Did it feel like Government Man, or did it feel like
No,
he's
I
actually
don't
curious?
even have to have a take because the conversations are that frank. Most of these guys understand, guys and girls, got to count Kirsten Gillibrand, the work that she's doing. They have an official stance that they have to take, but they know and will freely admit that they know they're being lied to. They know the government is, even the front-facing people at the Pentagon. Yeah, but they know it, and they're mad about it. They feel the same way about the situation that we feel about it. Now, the complexities that are involved, like if you're on the Senate Intelligence Committee and you're, after the hearing, you're back behind those closed doors, and then you come out of that meeting, it just suddenly becomes intensely complex. You can be like sitting, like I was sitting with Andre Carson, like me and you are sitting right now, and he's like, yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors. There's things I cannot tell you, but we're all being lied to by the government body politic. The story that we're hearing is not the story. You know it, I know it, the people know it, and they know that we know that they know that we know it. Doesn't matter.
How much of it is just government, though? And actually, that's a very bad way of asking the question. I need to elaborate on that so you can understand what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, because the whole conversation so far has been about how it's not just government.
Yeah. But like, when we think of government, sometimes we put it in like separate boxes. I mean, so we have like government like Congress, Senate, executive branch, and then we have government like agencies and things like that. And this conversation has been like there's a mix of a ton of this, and then there's people who are coming forward who now aren't in the government, allegedly. I get all that, but I'm saying at the core of it, even all the way back in the beginning of this history, which we can talk about how it's very interesting that this kind of started right after World War II, like a lot of the stuff.
Right.
It's not all of it. There's been reports throughout human history, but the heaviness of it really started after that. When you're dealing with these people who are guarding these secrets from the Andre Carsons of the world, from the Kristen Gillibrands of the world, the elected high-ranking people supposedly in our government, I start to then think about, like, for example, some of the other people you covered in your documentary, like a Robert Bigelow, who is and air quotes right here for people not listening, a private citizen.
Right.
And I start to wonder if any of these people, and this is where the tinfoil hat goes on, are any of these people we see who are private citizens all the way to, forget ufology for a second, all the way to funding political campaigns and things like that. Are they really private citizens, or are they a part of a game and it's just not written down on a central database somewhere?
There's probably something to that, but you know what it really is that you can't say the government because there's too many aspects to it. Now you have your front-facing guys like the elected officials that are brought into Congress. Yeah. And they have to respect certain privacies. Obviously, they take oaths, and if they're given confidential information, it's just like anybody else that has classified information. You can't reveal it. And this is an honor-bound system, and we should be very thankful that we have people that respect those oaths and those duties. So I used to be very militantly angry. When I started this doc, I was like that. I was like, how dare you keep this? This affects humanity. This affects my ability to live my life. You know something, like Lou and I sitting, just like you and I are sitting. And in the back of my mind during that whole interview, I'm like, dude, you have the keys to the kingdom and you're not going to tell me. And we're supposed to be okay with that. And back then I was like, I'm not okay with that. But over time and really understanding this, I'm a little more okay with it. I still think it sucks. I still think that if you have information that could vitally change the course of humanity, you need to take a really hard look at why you're keeping that from the planet. But I do see both sides of it now a lot more than I did. But back to your question, yes, we have the front-facing government, the elected officials. Then we have the body politic, the people that are there, the career people that have been there forever. And then we have the clandestine groups. And then below that, we have the black operations that really over time, they're accountable to nobody. And so the reason the military wasn't officially studying this, even though they were, but only in very compartmentalized avenues, is because there was a whole policy to put the ridicule factor into the front-facing rank and file of the military so that they didn't look at it. But the idea that they were never looking at it and it wasn't being studied by anybody ever is ludicrous. And that's what Accidental Truth is about. It's about, they rolled out this new narrative that said Project Blue Book ended. Nothing happened until the program started in 2004.
And for people who aren't familiar, who didn't see the James Fox podcast, can you just explain very quickly what Project Blue Book was?
Sure. So Project Blue Book was back in the 50s. There was a huge flap about UFOs. It was bigger than it is now in popular culture. Mm-hmm. And so the government did a couple of things to try to appease the public. And one of them was, we're going to do Project Blue Book. We're going to go and officially investigate this. How that turned out was that it really was not a real honest investigation into UFOs.
It's a cover-up.
It was a cover-up. Yeah, it was basically kind of a dog and pony show. And in Accidental Truth, we actually uncovered that there was a whole other parallel group that was studying these phenomena secretly while Project Blue Book was paraded in front of the public. So now, enter 2017-18, when we get these stories that come out, the resurgence of UFOs in common and military culture, that Project Blue Book ended with this official closing, and that the government had no involvement in UFO studies until they picked up the what was eventually the ATIP program. And the film is really all about uncovering that is completely untrue and showing a lot of what was going on, what they discovered, what they were studying, and what came out of these missing years. Because what we call the new narrative that says there was this big gap where government wasn't studying this at all, unfortunately, they're whitewashing that past because they want to be able to, the information is going to come to the surface, but how they got it and how they kept it a secret and how they manipulated it and who's been in control, that's this empty period between the 50s and the 90s and the 2000s where they can't talk about it. They've got culpability they have to relieve themselves of. They've got accountability that they're not going to take because terrible things were done to keep very important information away from the public. So if you are, quote unquote, the government, how are you going to get this information out? Because sooner or later, Elon Musk is going to land on Mars and he's going to know that there's something there. And private commercial space is going to come out and they're going to find something. A spaceship sooner or later is going to land. Some evidence that is irrefutable is going to come forward sooner than later in our day of technology.
You don't think those people are in on it? They got to be read in.
So I think they're read into a point. I think like I actually have this on good authority. I called Elon out about his thing about not saying aliens. I went on YouTube and did a video. Thousands of people watched it.
Not saying aliens?
Yeah. When Elon was at he was in Boca, Texas, where his Starlink or the Starship base is, and it was one of the times when he was revealing the prototype for the big Starship. Well, he came out during that speech and he says, aliens. I don't know. I've never seen any evidence of aliens. He says, and I should know. Well, the next day I made a YouTube video and I said, Elon, I don't know why you're saying this stuff. Why don't you talk to Robert Bigelow? I got a proposition for you. And I made it a big joke because at the time my studio was right across the street from SpaceX in Hawthorne. And I actually had a spaceship set in my studio where Kendrick Lamar came and shot his video with George Clinton. And so I'm like, Elon, come on, man, we're buddies. You got a spaceship in Hawthorne, California? I have a spaceship in Hawthorne, California. I mean, it makes us kindred spirits. And I made a joke out of it. But I said, look, private briefing. I will send some of the best experts in the world from MUFON and from the UFO community, and we just need a half hour of your time.
Yeah, that's not... Elon is... He's got contracts up and down with the government. That, to me, like, he knows. He knows what it is.
That's what I was getting to.
Yeah.
Is, we made that offer to him, and I know for a fact that because we put the media link to MUFON, they got overwhelmed with people saying, why don't you do it? Elon's thing, I believe, I can't say for sure, but I've also talked to people that run video production inside his organization.
He might be an alien.
Yeah, maybe. And the thing is he's got his interest in space, and he's been told by the people that are making sure that he gets to continue having an interest in space. Yes. Stay away from the alien thing. Just don't go there.
But here's a question. Why does he stay away, but Robert Bigelow goes right in?
Well, look what happened to Robert Bigelow when he did.
What happened to Robert Bigelow when he did?
Okay, they will deny that there's any connection because I personally asked people that would know if I was right. But when Robert Bigelow went on 60 Minutes and said there's definitely aliens, within a few months, Bigelow Aerospace imploded, supposedly because of COVID. His technology for these space habitats got sequestered off and cannibalized by a bunch of other companies, just took it. And NASA stiffed him for millions of dollars in owed contracts. He had to sue them to get his money.
And we had mentioned Bigelow earlier, but for full context for people who aren't totally aware, what was his claim to fame and who is he and how long has he been around?
So Robert Bigelow is a billionaire from Nevada. He made his money building like residential hotels for people. That's where he made his money, like budget suites, places where working people could have a place to stay for an extended period. He made a lot of money, and he always had an interest in the paranormal. At one point, he bought Skinwalker Ranch and formed the National Institute for Discovery Sciences, where basically he brought in this was formed around him meeting and getting to know a bunch of these guys that have been involved in some of these programs that we uncover in Accidental Truth, Hal Puthoff and guys like Eric Davis and some of the other people that were involved in this, Colonel John Alexander, who was running these secret government programs studying UFOs. In Accidental Truth, he reveals that he was actually with Robert Bigelow the day he bought Skinwalker Ranch, and he went and spent the first night alone up on the mesa. So all of these military spooky guys got with Robert Bigelow, and they formed this institute. And then right after he bought Skinwalker Ranch, here comes the Defense Intelligence Agency with a contract, and that was the beginning of ATIP, which was OSOP at the time. And I don't remember exactly what that stands for.
Yeah, what was the exact... So basically what Bigelow purchased and what he was building created what became a government agency called ATIP.
Well, it wasn't really... It was kind of like ATIP itself. Well, I'll go into that after I tell the story, because people don't really understand the taxonomy of how this all works. But Robert Bigelow formed the National Institute of Discovery Science with all of these guys that had government ties and backgrounds, and they were studying Skinwalker Ranch and other things. And that's when the DIA found out about what was going on, and they went there and they were intrigued, and so they decided to throw some money at it. But all these guys are connected and talking all along.
Yes.
It's not like suddenly something
it didn't fall from the sky.
Right. Yeah. So when the DIA got involved, the program was called OSOP, and the contract for that was given to Robert Bigelow. And some of the stuff that he was supposed to study was a weird phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch, but there were also things in the contract about studying materials, studying technology, studying human biological interfaces, and all kinds of different technologies that we don't have, all under one umbrella. And so that was the beginning of this program that came out with Lou Elizondo.
And when was that approximately?
Back in the 2000s, early 2000s.
Because that's where I get a little lost, because I'm like, it seems like it was born organically out of this quote unquote private citizen just investing in this stuff.
Well, it
and
was
with
born-
the connotation that then the government didn't already have something like that. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, that's a little sketch to me.
Well, see, this is all a part of coming up with a logical way to bubble this information to the public without having to admit where it came from. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that all of these guys that were in these government programs, mid-level, partially read in, they know enough to know that there's been crash debris. They know enough to know that there's different technologies that have been reverse engineered, but they don't know everything. And they're not even read in. But they've been read in enough to the point where they know enough to know what's going on with materials, with debris. They know about some of the programs.
Also, guys, until tomorrow, July 4th, you can get Accidental Truth on Apple for just $2.99 instead of $4.99. So hit the link in the description below and go check it out.
And then when they found Robert Bigelow, that was, he was interested in this stuff and he had money. And so that gave them another way to fund this stuff. Because a lot of the work that like Hal Puthoff and even John Alexander did back in the day was what they call ad hoc programs, which means that they weren't really official government programs, but they were being run by a bunch of people with all of the resources and access because they were in the government. And it's very common. And they call them ad hoc programs. And the reason they're ad hoc is because it enables them to not be accountable to Freedom of Information Act requests. In other words, if you have an official government program that's going to study something, well, then that becomes part of an official record that may have to be revealed. But if you have an ad hoc program where it's like, hey, I got this guy from the CIA, we all have clearances and we're all talking, and it's like, hey, what's this piece of technology?
But nobody knows nothing.
We think it's anti-gravity. We're going to have to look into that. And so they all get together and they decide that's what they're going to do. But it's not under an official auspice of a government program that's officially budgeted, blah, 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 blah. It's still being run with all the resources and abilities of people with high clearances, but it's an ad hoc program. Therefore, it's not accountable ever. And so Puthoff and Alexander and all of these different people back in the day were running a lot of these programs, some of them under official auspices, but also some of them as ad hoc programs. And when they got with Robert Bigelow, obviously running ad hoc programs means you don't have government money. And so Robert Bigelow was a breath of fresh air to these guys because he did have money, lots of it. And so when they formed the National Institute of Discovery Sciences, they were able to fund a lot of this research that these guys had been researching all along, but do it through a civilian mechanism.
And what's everyone always tosses around the Pentagon or stuff like that because, that's where we look for our defense and things. But how much of this is just people guessing oh, this shit happens in the Pentagon versus that's just an assumption and really we don't know where this is. We don't, where was the Blue Room again? Ohio?
Patterson Air Force Base.
So and that's probably a front for something. Do we even really know or have any definitive idea of where they actually do this stuff? I'll believe it if they're oh, Lou Elizondo had a desk that was in the Pentagon. Yeah, I'll believe that. He could have had a fucking computer like this at the desk and just, showed up to work 9 to 5. You know what I mean? Where they're actually doing this stuff. People talk about Area 51. That means that's probably not where it is now. Do we have any clues or are we just totally throwing darts against the wall on that?
There's a certain amount of evidence where different programs are happening. Eric Weinstein gives some really great interviews where he talks about that stuff. But
is he a Fed?
Well, aren't they all? Right? I mean, I don't know.
I like Eric.
I mean, the thing is once you're read into something, then you are part of the intelligence. And, you might not be a Fed per se, but once they pull you into that room and they reveal information to you and you agree not to share it, you become part of that system, for better or for worse.
Yeah, which actually, in all fairness to the people who find themselves in that situation, is not... I don't have a problem with that.
I don't either.
You're brought into the room and you're oh, by the way, you just signed a non-disclosure. You can't say shit about this. Well, guess what? They can't say shit about it. People, that's kind of the ivory tower part of things these arguments when we talk about ufology and stuff. I understand it's a huge secret. It's a whole meaning of life thing and people want to know, but you have to be Like, I think we run with like, people don't joke like I do about, like, the Fed thing. You know,
Right.
like, I get it. But other people are like, how dare they? These lizard people are keeping all these fucking secrets from it. It's like, you have to keep some level of, like, people understanding that people don't have this in their control. These are, you know, it's this, you keep on using the phrase read in. It's some guy who read in another guy, who read in another guy, who read in another guy, and maybe they didn't even want to know about it.
Right.
But now they're tasked with, like, they got to sit there, and I'm Lou Elizondo sitting across from Ron James, and I know that there's like 10 things popping in my head right now that my whole family's going to get murked if I say it.
Right. And that's a real thing. And
Yes.
in Accidental Truth, you know, I asked Lou about that, and he actually says, yeah, this is very uncomfortable. I do not want to be in the position I'm in, and if anybody could replace me, I'd do it. And I actually believe that of him personally. But I also believe that he is still working. Once you are in that deep in the intelligence community, you don't retire. Yeah, you're done. I mean, you are that for life. And so he did not deny it to me when I interviewed him. I said, Lou, you know, people think that you're part of an organized rollout of this information and that you're just basically accomplishing your mission right now. And he just sat back and smiled, you know, and it's like, of course. And it would be silly to think different. But does that make Lou a bad guy? No.
No, that's
you know, that's the whole point.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's I think you having that implicit, and I would even say based on how you're asking the questions, like explicit understanding is important, because you're not, the world is unfortunately far too complex to just be able to say, fuck it, yeah, we'll show you. Like even use one that's a one-off situation. Like, look at the JFK thing. They still, it's 60 years later. They still haven't released shit about that, obviously, right? If there were one or two people who worked somewhere in the government who had knowledge of it happening, think of all the hundreds of thousands of people who work in the government who had no idea any of that was going down. If the public got a hold in a mob of that evidence, even today, 60 years later, a lot of these people are dead. Most of them are dead. I don't think they could handle it, because the risk would be that they'd all descend upon Washington, D.C. and say, we're run by a bunch of murderers. And then suddenly the grip of democracy and having a place where you elect people to go, now suddenly, like, it's fragile and it could be ripped. So, like, do I want to know the actual evidence and, like, for sure be able to say, yes, Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana and the whole crew worked with so-and-so, this one guy at the government, and they whacked the president or something like that, and here's the stone cold evidence, and by the way, there were 3 shooters or something like that. Yes, I'd love to know that selfishly. But I have accepted the fact I'm probably never going to know that, and I understand why. I hate it, but I understand why. And I think more people have to have, this is just my opinion, but I think more people have to have that understanding. So to talk to someone who's making documentaries on something like this and goes into it getting that and not, you know, pounding the table just pissed off about it, you know, I think that's valuable, because it gives you going into these projects a dose of reality. You know, and that's an important thing, because sometimes we run with stories in spheres like this and they go too far, and what they do is then, you know, when people exaggerate things and stuff, it then affects everyone else in the space, and that the lowest common denominator becomes the definition, and things like this get laughed off. That's how it happens, you know?
And I wanted to avoid that with my movie.
Yeah.
It's like people are like, look, Accidental Truth is not like an episode of Ancient Aliens. It's not meant to be entertaining. It's not meant to be like sensationalized. Accidental Truth is a historical document. It is 89 minutes that if you know absolutely nothing about UFOs, you will be brought up to speed at least enough to understand that there's validity to this. There's nothing in it that doesn't have solid evidence behind it. And as Ralph Blumenthal said, can't remember if I used it in the movie or not, but he says, you know, what we can prove is compelling enough. We don't need to make stuff up. We don't need to reach for things that we cannot show evidence for. So this whole film brings us right up to the current day, going all the way back to the 40s. And even when we go back and revisit Roswell, which I hated to do, I didn't want to make a film that's a history lesson. And there's people out there that say, well, we knew all this stuff before. And I will be the first to admit, yes, there is stuff in this film that most people already know, especially if you're in the UFO community. But once you get into the last 3/4 of the film, the last 2/3 of the film, there's a lot of bombshells,
Yes.
literal bombshells. And I didn't make it to be like any other film. It is literally a snapshot in time with the best evidence ever to make the case. It was as if I was an attorney presenting the case for ufology, government cover-ups, and materials and crash debris to a jury. And I got some of the most prevalent people in the field to all but admit that it's all true. Chris Mellon, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, he put out that story when 2017 first came out. He says, well, the government's not studying UFOs at all. Now, I interviewed him right after that, and that Zoom interview that you see in the thing, it's a Zoom interview. It doesn't look that good, but I did that interview.
Everyone else was pretty much in person, though.
Yeah. But I did that interview, and I said, Chris, I couldn't put the whole question and answer in because I tried to keep things very concise through the film. But I said, look, Chris, here's the problem. You just went up and you put this big thing in the Washington newspaper.
I think it was New York Times for him, right?
No, it was the Washington something. At the Times or the Post, one of the two, for Mellon for his first story. But he and I said, look, here's the thing. You just said that the government has not been studying UFOs. You're towing the line that when this program that just came out, the ATIP program, that's the beginning since Blue Book. But we know that's not true. I'm with MUFON. We know that that's not true. We have plenty of evidence that there's been tons of government programs. And if you were the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, either A, you know and you're not telling, which makes you part of the cover-up, or B, you weren't read in. And right there in the interview, right there in the film Accidental Truth, he says, yeah, that's a good point.
You got me.
And then he goes on to explain, he says there's different levels of secret access programs. I had access to most of them, but there's also stuff at the Department of Energy, which was very telling because if you look into what the Department of Energy deals with, Bill Richardson ran the Department of Energy, and Bill Richardson comes out talking about how Roswell was a real thing.
Wait, that's not...
Governor Bill Richardson
He is the governor from New Mexico.
He was, yeah. And then he got the Department of Energy. He was digging into Roswell, and all of a sudden he's head of the Department of Energy. And we know that...
My man was, I just got to say this, my man was in Epstein's Black Book. He was a feature in that Black Book. That's
why he's laying low.
My
I tried to get him
for
the movie.
Right now.
Yeah. So, but anyway, Bill Richardson... was looking into it and made some very controversial statements. But my point, okay, so Chris Mellon acknowledges there's stuff in the Department of Energy that the Defense Department can't get to, and there's stuff in other government organizations, secret programs, that the Defense Department doesn't have access to. And then he goes on to say, and so is it possible that there was some group somewhere that had some crash debris or something? That's always possible. And in the interview, I just stop it right there in the film. It's like, excuse me, what did you just say? So that is why the film's called Accidental Truth, because as far as I'm concerned, that was an accidental truth. There's going to be people out there that say, well, he didn't just admit anything. I'm like, are you serious? Are you watching his face? Are you listening to his words? I backed him into the corner about making these public statements in a friendly way. And he tackled the answer, and the way he tackled the answer was to literally admit that there's probably people studying crash debris, and I couldn't get to it.
In their defense, on any admissions like that, though, they're admitting that the idea of things exists, which is big. Mm-hmm. But they're still not saying, and it's right here with these guys working on it, and here's how long they've been doing it, and here's what they found. So we're still left with the whole abstract idea of, well, what does that mean then? What do they have?
Right.
And that's the hard thing. Again,
that's in Accidental Truth. We go into that too. Where did nitinol come from? Where did transparent aluminum come from?
Yeah.
There is a whole list of material. There was a guy named Anthony Brugaglia, and a lot of people don't like him in the UFO community. For 2 years, he was petitioning the Department of Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency for any information in their possession with regards to residue, shot off flotsam, debris, materials recovered from UFOs by members of the U.S. government and being studied at Bigelow Aerospace. This is in the film. Yeah. And the government came back after 2 years of threatening, blah, 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 with answers responsive to your request. It was 300 and something pages of reports about materials that nobody knew existed. Okay. And there was a big blow up. All of the people that are protecting the new narrative, and you guys know who you are, they came out and they trashed this guy. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And the thing that they didn't address was that these are official government documents coming from the Defense Intelligence Agency admitting that there's UFO materials being studied at Bigelow Aerospace in Las Vegas, among other places. This was an admission. And then some people said, well, Freedom of Information Act responses aren't exact. And it's like, yes, they are. The people that release FOIAs make a habit of wordsmithing. Oh, I'm sorry, you said and instead of including. So you didn't get the answer you sought. Very specifically worded request, very specifically responsive answers. And so we have 7 or 8 different materials that were released and being studied. And the thing that all these materials had in common is that most of the reports were talking about what the materials might do, how they might be applied, and nothing about, basically, we didn't make them, we don't know. They don't come out directly and say that. But can you conceive of a corporation spending billions of dollars to come up with a material and they don't know what they're going to do with it?
No.
Okay.
Unless there were some dark funding saying, we just need you to come up with something.
Well, so like metallic glass was one of these materials. Remember back in Star Trek, right? Transparent aluminum. And it was a big thing. What people don't know is that they actually had transparent aluminum at the time. It was patented by Raytheon a few years back. And the origin of where Raytheon got the patents, that it's very, very murky. Same thing with nitinol, the shape-shifting alloy that we see now in industry. We traced its origins back to right through where they say it came from, all the way back to a private corporation that was studying materials under a Wright-Patterson contract around the time of Roswell. And we have the stories of the Roswell memory metal that you could wrinkle up and it would unfold.
Yeah.
That's a real thing now. We have metal that does that. And it came out of a laboratory studying Wright-Patterson materials research. And this is proven. Then there's other materials that they say came that may have a particular tunable resonance that was determined during manufacturing. They say that it may have a tunable resonance determined during manufacturing. Don't they know? If they manufactured it, wouldn't they know? If it had a tunable resonance that they determined during manufacturing?
Well, that could be, I'm playing devil's advocate, that could be legal cover because maybe it's, and I have no idea because I don't even know how this shit works, but like maybe it's because not every time it does, or they ran some tests where it didn't every time, and now they got to say it may. Like, I don't know if I'd read.
Well, the point is that these reports came out of a Freedom of Information Act request demanding information about debris recovered from UFOs by members of the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
And it's saying, it may have, a tunable resonance determined during manufacturing. Okay, but if we're manufacturing it, don't we know if it's going to have a tunable resonance or not? The point is that the way the reports are worded, we didn't make it. We're trying to figure out what it does. Every one of these 5 different reports about materials says it may do this, it may do that, it may have possible future implications.
Could it be, though, and this is where it can get murky with where does private end and public sector begin, right? Or government sector begin. But have you ever read Annie Jacobson's stuff, some of her books?
No, you were telling me about that.
I did talk to you about this yesterday. Okay, but for people out there who haven't heard of her or don't know, I talk about this a lot. My buddy Danny Jones at Concrete is reading like every word this woman's ever written, and he's like blown away by it. He's always telling me about it. I've read some of her stuff. It's pretty amazing work. But she's written about everything from Operation Paperclip post World War II to Area 51 to straight up CIA stuff to DARPA stuff. And DARPA's the one that's really interesting because DARPA that's the agency that or I don't even know if it's officially like an agency, but that's the government organization that in the mainstream you can bring up to people who know their way around with stuff and they'll be like, wait, what is that again? And meaning it's much more in the shadows more than some of these other places like the CIA and NSA and stuff. And some of the conjecture, I'll call it that that has been reported on that they're able to work on there is basically saying what I would say has been a public theory for a long time, that what they have is always far ahead of what the public has.
Well, sure.
But the conjecture goes as far as saying, no, it's like 50, 60 years ahead sometimes. That I have more of trouble believing. But when we're talking about private organizations like this, that you're talking about some of these reports where it comes out and they say, well, they don't know what they're working on. I wonder if they are basically partnered with DARPA in the sense that, like, we see a lot of ex-CIA spies, in air quotes, who work for fucking Raytheon or whatever. Right. It's just it's a numerical thing on a page for them to pay their taxes. It's not like they're not still. It's just a way for the government to be able to make sure they get paid to do the job they want to do for them. So when I look at Raytheon or these other places, when it comes to some of these projects, I start to wonder, is it the same thing? And then take it a step farther. If it's not something that in these public reports or the things that get pulled out of FOIA that they write that they understand, is it because it's something that's been developed in highly experimental scientific stuff behind the scenes via something like a DARPA that, like, yeah, the world doesn't have a concept of it, but we have it. Like, I always bring up the example when David Fravor, who gives amazing testimony on what he saw from the Nimitz with the Tic Tac, and he gives you the radar. It's really compelling stuff, and I think he's a great witness. When I see something like that, and that was in 2004, I think, when he saw it, I'm like, that feels like that could have been DARPA technology. So when I hear things like the metamaterials, my mind does go to that first. Not to be like too much of a skeptic, but I'm like, is this stuff that they have physically understood and we're just not there yet? Do you ever consider that as a possibility?
Well, it's a matter of connecting the dots and doing the thought experiment and reading the reports. If you've got a Freedom of Information Act request that you have had to threaten to sue the Defense Intelligence Agency for 2 years before you finally get an answer, and then they finally come back, and there's numerous exchanges between this Anthony Bragalia guy and this the guy from the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was one person, an information officer. His name was Stephen Tominski. And I have these. I can't put everything in the film, but everything in the film is backed up by pages and pages of reference material. So we have the letters that went back and forth over 2 years, and there's one letter that says very clearly, just to recommit before we present you with this information, you want the material related to material recovered from the Department of Defense from UFOs and studied at Bigelow Aerospace. Yes. Here's the documents. Now, you could just stop right there and say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the government just gave this guy reports that they specifically are admitting are what he asked for. Information about materials recovered by the U.S. Department of Defense from UFOs being studied at Bigelow Aerospace and other places. That's what they gave him. So they give him these reports. So you could just stop right there and say, well, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the government is acknowledging that they got this stuff from this, and it took 2 years and a lot of research to get the material. But then when you look into the actual reports, now, sure, nitinol is something that's mainstream. So is transparent aluminum. That's being studied at DARPA as an armor. You
mentioned the nitinol very quickly earlier. I can't remember if you gave the full context of what that was.
It's a shape-shifting, memory-retaining alloy. That basically we use it today in a lot of things. NASA's making spaceship wheels out of it. It's used in medical devices. They make stents out of it. It's a metal that you can bend it and then just let go of it, and it'll bend back to the position it was in originally, which is exactly what's described from Roswell as this material that you could bundle up and it would come back.
Right.
And so the origin of nitinol, supposedly, from a naval research laboratory back in the 60s or late 50s. In fact, the name nitinol stands for naval something, something, something. And that's where it came from, right?
Just talking in the mic, by the way. Just way better.
But so not so fast about nitinol. Nitinol is a titanium alloy. And what we find is that before the Naval Weapons Research Laboratory or whoever says they invented it had it, there was a scientist at a place called Battelle Memorial Institute, which is still a huge contractor for the government, who did some of the very earliest studies on titanium alloys, and because titanium wasn't a big thing. until this stuff came out of Battelle. The Battelle research went to the Naval Weapons Research Laboratory that says they invented nitinol, but it was created at Battelle. And Battelle, at the time, had a contract with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to study materials. And so that's the thing about the film and all this evidence. You start connecting these dots. You start running out of different places to go. And then as they go and we talk about the other materials that are mentioned in the reports, may induce invisibility by reflecting or reflecting light. Now, we know that we have technology that we're studying right now that does it. We know DARPA has it, but where did it come from? And where did the idea come from? So we have these reports that are saying not this material induces invisibility. It says it may. And so these are early reports about the preliminary assessments of these materials before they got into DARPA, before they got into private industry. Then we have another one that has the interesting ability to compress electromagnetic energy. Now, they don't know how to do that. They didn't at the time. Dr. Michio Kaku comes on in the film and says, we have ways to create materials that will mimic invisibility.
Yes.
But we cannot yet do it in the optical frequencies. But in these reports, it talks about material that can do it in the optical frequencies.
What does that mean when he says that, in the optical frequencies?
Basically, the way I got it from his explanation is that, say you got something a material that if you put it under a certain kind of light, could become transparent and induce invisibility. Yeah. Now, that's a spectrum frequency. It's done under artificial conditions. The optical frequency means that I could take this material and I could put it anywhere and it would render whatever invisible in the optical frequencies. So in other words, it would work anywhere. He says we can't do that yet, but these reports talk about materials that may be able to do it. And I've seen stuff that is mimicking that, like the invisibility cloak that you see on YouTube. So we're not far, and DARPA's probably already got it.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
they got
but
that shit.
The idea came from somewhere, and the government admitting these reports about these materials that may do this. Yeah, we're dealing with technology that we have now that probably came from some of this stuff. But the point of all of that is that this guy fought for this information, and when it came out, the Pentagon walked it back immediately, saying, oh, no, that's not UFO stuff. Well, then why are you telling us it is? And why can't you, to this minute, why can't you tell us what this material does? And why can't we see a sample of it? I mean, it's just like, as you follow the rabbit hole and you follow the dots that I lay out in the movie, I'm not coming to conclusions for the viewers. I'm saying, here's the evidence. It will stand up. You can ask me all day long about where I got this, what it means, where it came from, how legit is it, and I can answer all those questions. There's nothing in the movie that's not coming from factual base. And a lot of it is coming from stuff that came straight from the government in forms of freedom of information requests.
Yeah, but to your points from earlier, obviously I want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding that. Obviously there is some of the people you're talking to are giving some sort of factual cover, like with some sort of like, what's the word? Not reflecting. Why can't I think of that? This always happens. Something about listening to these headphones and hearing yourself back. Sometimes you can't think of the right word. That's the one
deflection.
Thing that... Yes.
Yeah, Chris Mellon says that to me. He says, no, it's not in the film, but right after that he said, and maybe this is a deflection, but there are people in Congress that are allowed to answer this question. And I'm like, well, Chris, you're talking about the Gang of Eight, the 8 members of Congress that are supposed to be able to get to everything. But if you can't get to everything, how can they get to everything?
And you're a Mellon.
Yeah,
you're
but
a member of the Mellon family.
Yeah, and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence for under 2 administrations. Okay, and so to be able to, I'm not going to say to be able to back him into a corner, but be able to ask him an extremely pointed question that I might mention he will not answer now to anyone, and get him to give me a good answer. It was because I was working with History Channel at the time to help them promote that show Unidentified, where the TTSA guys all came up and had a whole show.
I don't think I saw that. Oh.
Yeah, it was Lou and Chris and everybody kind of going back and retracing to some of the steps. That's where the pilots all came out. But I was working with History Channel, plus, I was with MUFON, and that's how I got that interview, is the people at A&E kind of told Chris, yeah, it's okay, talk to him. And that was when that's when I was going in. I think I just messed up the headphones.
No, you're good. I'm looking at you. You look great. But when you look at organizations like something like MUFON, which is like a community, and then you look at things like History Channel, which is like media, obviously some of the very people who are being interviewed by these places, by someone like you, who's a representative of both, or other people on these shows like you just mentioned, obviously it includes the Lou Elizondos, the Chris Mellons, the government guys who they can say some things, they can't say some other things, they may be told to say some things on purpose for a specific reason. Like, that's obviously some sort of deflection for the government. But like, how much do you feel the paranoia of being surrounded by people who are, for lack of a better way of putting it, plants to make sure that places like MUFON don't get to information that they don't want them having? Like, is that a constant, like, every conversation you get into, like, oh, maybe this guy works for him or something like that? Or are you more just kind of resigned to the fact that that exists and it just is what it is?
I'm resigned to the fact that it exists, which makes me constantly thinking about how to get one step ahead of it.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it's like that. That's what I did with this movie. Is like every piece of information in this film, I got it fair and square.
Yes.
I got it out of these guys. I didn't have to say, well, you could tell me, but I won't tell anybody. I never made what I call the devil's deal. And the devil's deal in ufology is when you get called in by somebody in the know and they say, and you're a UFO investigator and you're all about getting the truth to the public, but all of a sudden you're in this room and they tell you something that, and you agree that you're going to keep it. You just sold your public integrity to the topic for personal information that you personally crave. And once you make that deal, and there's a lot of you out there that have done it, and you know who you are, and I know who you are. There's a lot of them out there that have done it. And now they're towing the new line. They're towing the new narration. They're telling the new story, which is basically we're whitewashing this last 50 years. And the information that we came up with over the last 50 years, we're using these new ways to introduce it to the public. So that's a lot of what the Bigelow Aerospace Project was all about, was how do we take this black stuff, black ops stuff, and top secret discoveries and technology and data, and how do we get it into the public in a way that we can just pretend all that stuff didn't happen. And so, oh yeah, let's study materials at Bigelow Aerospace. They probably never even had the materials. That's a whole debate in itself, because when this story came out,
what makes you say they never had it?
Well, because they want you to believe they never had it. Again, in Accidental Truth, we point out that that for a long time it was being reported and acknowledged that there were materials being studied at Bigelow Aerospace. There were news stories done about it. There were newspaper articles done about it. Then all of a sudden, after this big drop of the Freedom of Information Act about the materials, it's an about face. A whole group of people come together and say, oh, wait a minute. We said that there were facilities prepared to study materials at Bigelow Aerospace, but we never said he got them. And you see in the film, you see Ralph Blumenthal doing that, and you see George Knapp doing it, where George says, did you ever have, the New York Times reported that you prepared your facilities to study materials. Did you ever have them? And Bigelow's like, no, I never saw anything. And people have to wait to see what happens next. But the point is, when this stuff dropped from the FOIA requests, all of these new narrative backing people discredited it. The Pentagon discredited it. And then there was this big movement to get rid of any implications that Bigelow is involved in studying materials. And my personal opinion, and I can't prove it, but I think it makes a strong case, is that after the Alien 60 Minutes flap, Robert Bigelow didn't want anything to do with more classified, potentially sensitive information getting out with his name on it. And so there was an effort to walk the whole thing back about what happened at Bigelow. But we know that the files for OSOP and ATIP are there at the Bigelow Aerospace plant. The photos, the pictures, the documentation, it's all still there, or at least it was when I made the movie. So his involvement in this has, and his desire to at least drop significant hints to the public might have cost him a lot. You know, now he's doing life after death. He's not even doing the UFO thing. And this was after the drop of the material study information.
Or that could be a public front.
Well, my personal opinion is that, he said some things that he shouldn't have said. And and he paid a price for it.
It's also calculated, though.
But I can't prove that. But I do believe it.
He went on 60 Minutes. He planned out doing it. It wasn't like, TMZ caught him outside his house and he said something.
Right.
It was...
I think he planned it, but I'm not convinced that he had permission from the ground all the way up. I don't think that his handlers had said, hey, go on 60 Minutes and say there's aliens. And, again, another thing we point out in the film is that at the time he did that, this was months before the New York Times article broke and the admission about ATIP came out. Nobody knew who Bigelow was at the time. He went on 60 Minutes and said, yes, there's aliens. But a couple months later, I can't remember the exact time frame, but very shortly afterwards, when the ATIP story broke and Elizondo and all this, and it exploded into the mainstream, then all of a sudden, if you went back and cross-referenced what he said on 60 Minutes, and now you had this new information about who he actually was and what he was actually doing, it changed the entire landscape. And that escaped most people.
It also doesn't help that he looks like a Spider-Man villain. Something about like the close-cut stash and everything, like the perfectly coiffed hair. I don't know. Something about that. Again, like that's where I get my red lights go up and I go, okay, what's the real angle here? I mean, maybe. I could see what you just said could absolutely be true.
Well, look, okay, I'm starting to understand your thought process. Okay, so you have the evidence chain, everything is laid out, the things that Robert Bigelow said, the government contracts that are in writing, the reports that are in writing. But the one thing that tilts you over to thinking there might be something to it is he kind of looks like a villain from a Marvel movie.
He does. He looks like he runs a mass media empire and, fucks his secretary on the desk and yells at people on the phone and is read in at the CIA, or I don't know, something like that. My mind goes to those places. I'm just suspicious of people like that because I don't think I've ever known anyone knowingly who's like in those circles. I've been privileged to know some pretty cool people.
He's got his own space station. And remember, folks, if Julian says it, it must be true.
that is not true at all. Let's edit that one out. Christ. I try to get it right, but I don't fucking know. I'm just a podcaster. But when the other thing like that I think is often lost in these conversations is we keep talking about these people, whether it be the private side people like the Musks and the Bigelows, and then, on the government side, we're talking about whatever that unnamed organization is, but they're all a part of these other organizations. It's always America-centric, right? So...
Well, there is a reason for that.
Why?
It is believed by some people, and there's a certain amount of anecdotal evidence to support this, that back when the military and the government were first working on the UFO thing, whether it was a crash that happened in the 40s or whatever, that there was a kind of like a very covert international agreement that there was going to be this group that managed it, and it was, an American-centric group. And that is why you don't see this major disclosure. The Ancient Aliens did an episode about this, where they're basically saying that there's this group that goes and handles this on a worldwide basis, and it's by treaty at the very deepest levels, and that might be true. But the UFO phenomenon is not American-centric.
Right.
The same stuff that's happening in America is happening all over the world, in some places even more.
And that's my issue, because we talk about the power-centric struggle of it in American terms. Now, other places, I have a lot of listeners around the world who, in their own countries, they know more about, this talk there. Like, you talk to Nick Pope as well, which I want to get back to that. He's from Britain. But, it's like... Would the Men in Black just be American? No. Like, to me, no. Would this knowledge not be some sort of, and I say this with an understanding mindset to this. This isn't like taking a shot. I'm saying, would it not be some sort of global governments coming together on agreement, like at the highest levels? Like, oh shit, people can't know about this.
Right.
I would understand that completely. I just feel like we look at it, and again, maybe it's just because I live here and, we're both American, like, so this is the context we talk about it in, but, where's the Elon Musk in Europe? Where's the Robert Bigelow in China? They exist, I'm sure, but we still talk about it as if all the answers lie in D.C. or fucking Las Vegas or something.
Well, Americans tend to be like that anyway.
Yes.
We see the world through, very, very narrow focus, and we don't think internationally, and we think, we're the center of everything. But there is a lot of people out there are a lot of people out there that will talk about the fact that this must be by some kind of clandestine international treaty, that the level of secrecy is agreed upon, and the processes for investigating these cases is agreed upon. And it probably does come largely headquartered in America, but this is an organization of people like the Men in Black movie. You know, people think that's a big comedy, but and it is. But
Based on truth.
Yeah, it's quite possible that there is a very clandestine organization worldwide that manages this stuff, and that it's out of politics, it's out of international disputes, it's deeper than that, it's beyond that, and it's bigger than that, and there's been a lot of cases made for that being a possibility.
The problem with any of this stuff, not just aliens or organizations that run that secret, but for any type of secret or power. The buck has to stop somewhere, right? Even if we can't see it, it stops somewhere. So you talk about like, a great example, like even some bullshit political example. You have socialists and libertarians, right? And I'm going to generalize here, but like on the purest end of those spectrums, the socialists would want the buck to stop with, in broad terms, the government handling everything. And the libertarians would want the individual handling everything. But if you go that far on the spectrum in either direction, it always ends badly. Mm-hmm. There's different ways it ends badly, but for different reasons it ends badly. So when you're talking about now like a closely held secret like this, wherever that organization is, all over the world, whoever's in it, whatever, the buck is stopping with them. So they may have made a decision based on things you said previously that I think have validity to it, where you're talking about like presidents aren't even read in on this stuff or can't get to it. Someone is making that decision somewhere, unelected, or a group of people, to not read in like quote unquote the most powerful person in the world, and then look at other world leaders of other major countries, the most powerful people in the world, and they're doing it out of some sort of what we hope is
altruism.
Yes, and the good of humanity, but who the fuck are they to say that?
Well, see, that's the thing. We don't know that, and a lot of people don't believe that.
Yeah.
At some point, whoever was tasked with managing this information got bigger and bigger, more powerful, better funded, with less accountability. Yeah. And now it is being, well, you know, people say that we have a shadow government that's running the entire planet and politicians mean nothing. Who's to say, if you just apply that, which is common understanding, to the people managing the UFO information, it's not a stretch to think that there's this group that's pretty much accountable to nobody running this. Richard Dolan goes even farther, thinking that there's a whole breakaway civilization where these guys have spaceships and all kinds of other stuff, and we don't even know. It's, you know, possible. I'm not signing on to that because I can't prove it. I can't find the paper trail, and I've looked for the paper trail about, you know, spacefaring submarines and stuff. Can't find anything that really indicates that these things were ever built. But back to the point, there's plenty of examples throughout history of organizations and people that have this autonomy and are able to function without accountability to anybody. And so, you know, if you're the guys that are managing the UFO secret, and you're the guys that have that technology, and you've been working with industry on a clandestine basis for what's going on 100 years now, you're a pretty powerful group.
I'll say. For sure. And again, like, there has to be, you know, you can't just like dislike a couple things that some of these organizations do and then be like, well, that means the whole thing has to go. Unfortunately, the world is, as we said multiple times, not very complex. So there's gonna be negative with whoever is in charge of situations like this, as far as like, you know, closely guarded secrets. It just, that's the reality of it. That is what it is. But I'm curious, with all the topics you covered in the film, like, as you said, you named Accidental Truth because of some of the quote-unquote accidental truths that were revealed through answers by, like, Lou and Chris Mellon. But what was the most, if you haven't already mentioned it, what was the most shocking, or not even shocking, surprising thing that you uncovered in making this film that you didn't previously have any idea about or expectation about?
I think that for me personally, as the filmmaker, the most shocking thing was what we were talking about earlier, the very beginning of this, is that there's a good possibility that this evidence in this story has not been properly preserved. And that is the thing that shocks me the most, is that something of this much historical significance could be gone forever. And the people that knew about it are largely all dead. The people that were there when it began, they're largely all dead. And there's a pretty good case that some of the information and some of the evidence is not really stored in some central repository where somebody has the entire story under one roof. And that's frightening, because the idea that it was kept a secret from all of us over these years, that's one thing. That's bad enough. But the idea that it was kept a secret in such a way that maybe there's not even anybody who really knows the whole story anymore, that's really frightening. And when I first was making the film, and I was talking to Lou's people, they're like, well, we're working on this documentary. It's going to be the definitive UFO documentary, and Lou's in it. And I'm like, look, man, I don't think you guys can make the definitive UFO documentary because you're not read in. And you're not gonna go the places that I've gone and tell the story that I've told, because it's not part of the official line that you're gonna have to toe.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
If you want to go and make a UFO documentary where you talk to members of Congress and you talk to NASA and you talk to all these guys and you get the cooperation of all these people, you're telling us an organized story that is not true. Because NASA, who just heroically said they're going to start looking at UFOs, I mean, come on, man, really? You're going to start looking at UFOs, NASA, now. Okay, let's just put that one aside. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. So anybody that's going to, well, we've got the head of NASA, we have the Intelligence Committee, we got the Secretary of Defense. Okay, like Mike Barra says in my movie, you're not the right people to be coming out with this, because you're the ones that have been lying to us for all these years. And so anybody that thinks they're going to go and feature all these people in a way that I didn't do it, I got to people in this movie that I shouldn't have gotten to. Nobody else can get to them in the way I did, and because they're very protected. Even Gary Nolan now, you can't get him hardly at all. He's under contract right now to not be doing these kind of appearances. But we got to him fair and square. But I did it. Usually, if you can get to the Elizondos, if you can get to the Mellons, if you can get to some of the other people that are in my film, you're being allowed access to them because you're pretty much agreeing that you're going to toe the line. The interview that I got with Lou Elizondo was in 2018. It was at the MUFON Symposium where he came to speak. And I'll tell you, he came into that room with me. Tom DeLonge was calling the whole time, telling him, get out, don't do the interview, don't do the interview. He showed up in a bulletproof vest because he was afraid he was going to get shot. And
Lou Elizondo was wearing a bulletproof vest in your interview.
No, he took it off for the interview. But no, he was at the MUFON conference in a bulletproof vest. It was right in the middle of the media tizzy around TTSA. And basically, everybody in TTSA was under contract. The media surrounding that group became a very valuable asset. It turned into the show Unidentified, and Tom DeLonge and some of the other people had plans to turn TTSA into a scientific research group, but also an entertainment company that basically had copyrights on pretty much anything and that was out there. So this interview that I got with Lou, you see him out there all the time. You see him on podcasts. You see him on Zoom calls, but you don't ever see him sitting in a studio perfectly lit and with good audio, because there's no other interviews out there that weren't managed by TTSA in those conditions. And that's what made that interview so valuable. And that's why I got so much resistance in using it. I was threatened over that interview.
But who the fuck is Tom DeLonge? Obviously, he's Blink 182 guy. But, that was one of the most unintentionally funny parts in your movie when you were talking about To the Stars and you have Tom DeLonge coming out on the stage talking about it. And then, and here's his 5 board members. Fed. And I'm just like, and you even said something sly, obviously all CIA, NSA, so whatever. Yeah. But how does Tom DeLonge, no disrespect, he doesn't seem like the second coming of fucking Albert Einstein. How does he end up in this situation where he's telling Lou Elizondo, you're going to do what I tell you to do?
Well, here's what happened. Okay. And there's, this is a very, very interesting story. And,
please do tell.
All right, so Tom DeLonge was, and let me caveat this, okay? This is my opinion, a lot of it, from what I've understood. I am not going to say that everything I'm about to say in this thing is absolute fact, but this is what my impression of what I have uncovered is. Tom DeLonge was poking around government, trying to get to people that could tell him about UFOs. And he was doing that because he was just a regular guy. Yeah, he happens to be a rock star, but he was interested in the topic, and he opened a lot of doors because he was a rock star. And before TTSA, years before that, he did a couple of UFO conferences where he talked about that. He did the International UFO Conference he videotaped in, and he's like, "Look, I'm just like you guys. I just want to know what's going on," and that's all legit. In fact, there's really nothing illegit about what Tom's tried to do.
Except that his whole board is fed.
Well, see, okay, so this is how it evolves. So he was getting to some people, and he was getting some answers, and he was getting told some things. And when the powers that be behind the Lou Elizondo and the whole rollout, which I believe was a very organized thing, that the TTSA was waiting in the wings. Lou and Chris came forward with this information. They didn't do that in a vacuum. They were cleared to do it. But Ralph Blumenthal, who wrote the article in my movie, says, "Oh, no, that's not true." But if you put the pieces together, it has to be true. And maybe Ralph doesn't understand it. But when Lou wrote his resignation letter to the Department of Defense, then he went and met with Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, and he showed them, and he told them about the program. TTSA was already formed, organized, and ready to go. It didn't just form in 2 weeks. So what it looks like to me is that all of these guys had this plan to roll out TTSA, and as a way of opening up information to the public that was going to be very organized and very well done. Tom DeLonge made himself very useful to the powers that be because they're like, wait a minute, let's put this whole thing under this guy.
Blink 182 for aliens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He was Leslie Kean in that series that J.J. Abrams produced was talking about Tom DeLonge's role in it, and she actually said that he was a useful idiot to these people. I think that's horrible. I think that's horrible that she said that.
She might be right, though.
But it might not be far from the truth. But, bless Tom.
It's kind of funny.
But anyway, so the TTSA was waiting in the wings with this fundraising thing. They came out, Tom DeLonge on stage. He had all these guys. Now, all these guys had been brought into this organization. It didn't happen by accident. This was how they decided they were going to begin this rollout. When Lou submitted his resignation letter and went to the New York Times, he submitted that resignation letter. He lost a certain amount of retirement income from resigning early from one of the organizations that he worked with. But he did that, in my opinion, because he knew that he was going to jump onto the TTSA and they were going to go out and raise millions and millions of dollars. Unfortunately, they only raised like $2.7 million. It wasn't enough. And so basically over time, and for a variety of reasons, that organization kind of imploded. It's still out there. It's still doing things. It still has some of its original members, but they never raised the millions and millions and millions of dollars they thought they were going to raise. So what happened then is that, Lou and everybody kind of branched out. The whole plan fell apart. And the TTSA taking the lead and leading everybody toward disclosure, that was plan A for getting this technology to the mainstream, is TTSA is going to bring it and bubble it up. Well, that didn't work. And then all these unexpected FOIA releases came out. And then the Defense Intelligence Agency releases these DIRDs that supposedly came out of Bigelow Aerospace, investigating dozens of different technologies that we don't have. The whole thing is the result of an organized plan going sideways. And it's because what we're witnessing in the mainstream is an internal battle between the people that manage this information and want it out, and the people that manage this information and don't want it out. And
does the former really exist, though?
There's, in my opinion, again, if I knew all this stuff, then we'd all know it, right? There's factions that think that there needs to be more disclosure, and there's factions that think absolutely not. And there's a lot of reasons. That's it. That's the other thing that we have to think about is what is the real reason for this secrecy? Obviously, a logical argument for that is that one of the reasons for the secrecy is that the people don't need to know. It could upset society. That's been the oldest reason given, and it still has a certain amount of validity. But, I think the other reason is the technology. The people that have it don't want to share it, and they don't want to have to explain where they got it. And you're dealing with corporations. if Lockheed Martin developed the coding for the stealth fighter because they got something off of a spaceship and it's it's anti-radar, blah blah blah, and now it's on our stealth fighters, and they're the only ones that have it, why do they want to tell anybody where they got it?
Right.
And now you're dealing with corporations and money. But the other thing is, what is the context of this information? And what I mean by that, okay, so you hear the question all the time. Well, the public's ready for it. And you might say, yeah, we're ready for it. But, the question is, we're ready for it only if the context is okay.
Right.
So it's no longer an answer. It's no longer a question that can be answered with, of course we're ready. It's a question that has to be caveated with, well, it's going to depend on what the implications are.
Yes, you can't know if it's ready unless you know what it is. Which,
Yeah, I mean, if they come out tomorrow and they say, "Oh, hey, there's aliens out there," but they leave us alone, we leave them alone. We don't really know what's going on. We've had brief interactions, but they're very superior to us, and they don't really see us as much. But they're not going to hurt us. And then people are going to go, yeah, we knew of something like that. And they're going to get up the next day and they're going to do largely what they did the day before. But if it comes out, hey, there's aliens out there, we think they might have nefarious plans for us. Hell, we might be being raised for food. Who knows? We don't know, but they're dangerous, so we can't defend against them. That changes your daily life as of now. So the context of disclosure, what it means to how it affects you personally, is really what the societal reaction is going to be.
I'm going to play a guess game with this because I obviously don't know. But when you're sitting across from a guy like Lou and he's saying, I can't talk about this, I can't talk about that, but he has flown out here to this conference on MUFON. He's a part of at the time, growing endeavor called To the Stars, has a family at home. When talking to other people who know him, like James Fox, like good guy, goes about life, does his thing. If he had possession, personally, of information that quite literally defined the meaning of life and perhaps did it on a level where it was the type of stuff that if people found out, the world would riot and humanity would end because we'd figure out that there maybe wasn't a point to it, or like we're all simulated or something like that. I don't know how he would sit there and, like, not to go, like, graphic with it, but I don't know how he wouldn't, like, I don't know how he'd want to live or interact. So when I think about, because he's the one facing the camera, right? We don't know all the guys that aren't facing the camera
Right.
and what they think and whether they're at the bottom of a whiskey bottle right now. But he, by all intents and purposes, seems to be like a fairly normal guy. I don't know him, but that's just how it comes across. If it were that deep, or if he knew that a secret alien overlord were running the earth from below the sea or something like that, I don't think he'd be able to sit there and have a conversation on camera at the fucking MUFON conference. I
got to tell you, you haven't seen the whole conversation because we talked about that. And one of the things that he told me, and it's in the interview, the whole interview will see the light of day one day, but I'm being, even though it's my interview, I own it. He agreed to do it. He signed off on it. I still have gotten a lot of resistance.
From who?
From people that represent Lou.
And who are these people? Is it like some secretary, or is it, someone deep throat on the phone?
Media reps. People that have that see him as a valuable piece of intellectual property.
And what did they say to you? And did they call you? Did they show up at your house? Like, how does that?
It's not that clandestine. Basically, when I sold the doc to the distributor, it was originally going to be called the Elizondo tapes, and people that represent Lou came and said, no, you can't even use that interview unless we agree to let you. And I said, well, it's my interview. I'll do whatever I want to with it. And then the distributor came to me and said, well, we understand that it's your interview, but you're going to have to play nice with these guys, or we're not going to buy your movie, and we're not going to release your movie.
What year was that?
This was back when I signed the deal about 2 years ago.
So the movie was originally going to be called the Elizondo tapes.
Yeah, that's what my original contract was, because I have a whole bunch of more stuff that is very, very controversial that's in my interview and within some other information.
So based on this resistance, and then the fact that you were getting a lot of other information that wasn't necessarily directly related to that.
I turned the corner with the movie because A, they weren't going to let me call it the Elizondo tapes, and B, that's when I brought in Michio Kaku and Gary Nolan and all these other people to make it bigger than just Lou Elizondo, because if I continued down the track of making it about Lou and making it about the stuff that he told me that to this day is not out, I was going to have a lot of problems getting the film out.
Were you scared of that?
I was very scared, yeah. I've been, the film came out April 18th, 2023. And until midnight on April 17th, before I saw that icon pop up on Amazon Prime, I still was not convinced it was ever going to see the light of day. The story of the beginning of this ordeal of making the film all the way to seeing it out in the public, if making my next film means I have to go through what I've been through for the last 2 years, I don't care if I ever pick up a video camera again, as long as I live. It's been, I can't even describe it. And there's a lot of stuff I just can't even talk about. And there's stuff that even if I did talk about, you'd just think I was crazy.
But you said it's less clandestine than we think. It's pretty straightforward.
That particular element of it was less clandestine, yeah.
What other elements are there? Okay. Fair enough. You're giving a lot today, so I'm okay with that.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I was totally under surveillance the whole time I was making the movie. My phone, and this comes with the territory with being part of MUFON. They're under surveillance anyway, by people that are keeping track of what the UFO community is doing. It comes with the territory. You take it for granted. Your phone's tapped. They're watching your computer. If they feel like it, they're following you. Every once in a while, you find some little evidence in your house that somebody's like stuff moved, that there's no explanation for how it got moved. It's a little calling card. We can get to you. It happens. And it sounds like something right out of a freaked out movie, and I don't want to be the guy out there saying it because it just makes me look stupid, but I've lived it. It's part of the thing. And the information in Accidental Truth, there's a lot of people that didn't want that stuff out, and there's still a lot of people that don't want it out, and there's still an active effort to quash the film even though it's out. And I have had to, at every turn in the process of making this movie, I've had to understand what I was up against, and I've had to adjust my trajectory to sidestep their latest attempt to put obstacles in front of me.
Despite the fact that it came across as far more out in the open as you would have thought. My head's going on. My head's going on.
What do you mean?
Meaning the way you started this by saying it's a lot less clandestine than you think.
No. The situation with media representation by some of the people that were in it, some of the threats that I got over using certain things in the film.
What does a threat look like or sound like?
If you put this out there in this way, I'm going to sue you. That's what it looks like.
Okay, so fairly.
So when I say less clandestine, that's what I mean.
Got it.
So nobody.
It wasn't like, do you like your dog?
Not directly.
Like okay.
No.
Okay.
Because I still have the dogs.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's good. I just.
No, I'm not. I was never like threatened in that direct manner, but I was basically, some of the content that was supposed to be in the film was pretty much nixed by the threat of the film won't come out. Some of the actions that I threatened to take to preserve my right to release the film was nixed in, you can go in that direction, but we're going to put your film on a shelf till it's over. And so some of the powers that be that managed to get a certain amount of control over the film used it to do as much manipulating as they could. And I did everything I could to get around that, including hiring lawyers over fair use, hiring lawyers over witness protection and whistleblower stuff, just to find out, what the implications were of revealing some of the information. And there's information that I didn't put in the film that could technically be termed as classified still. And if you put that out, even though you got it from a non-classified source, you can still get in trouble for revealing classified information.
Really?
Yeah.
Even if you don't know?
If you know it's classified and you put it out anyway.
But couldn't you have deniability on that? Like, I didn't know it was classified.
Really? You want to sit in a room with a bunch of FBI guys and try to pull that off?
Yeah, that's true. I always forget they hold the cards. It's already predetermined what they're going to do.
And you know,
fair.
the truth is that I would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes. And my hard drive's chattering away, and this happened about every week.
Your hard drive's what?
Chattering away in the middle of the night, and I look at my computer, and you can tell data is being transferred across the internet. They're basically harvesting my hard drive, I believe, keeping up with what I was doing with this movie and keeping an eye on it. And I still to this day think the only reason that it's out is because it was allowed to be put out, not because I forced my way into the public with it.
Did you find? I mean, you've already kind of said like there's some things you didn't put in there, obviously, so it's a piece of it. But you also said that it started off as the Elizondo tapes, and then you went with a lot of the other information you have to make an amalgamation. You know, not just completely focused on him, even though he was still heavily featured in it. Like, do you think you heavily were creating and while in the creating process self-censoring out of that fear?
Absolutely. Yeah. There was a lot of things that I just didn't put in there because I didn't want to leave stains on the people in the movie. You know, like people have said that there's a lot of stuff in the film where people said something and then went, whoops. But there's a whole lot more that will not see the light of day. Because at the end of the day, I promised myself two things. One is I wasn't going to denigrate anybody. You know, and I don't know if you notice this in the film, but we don't tell people what to think. We don't say, hey, this person's not telling the truth. We don't say, hey, this person's a bad person. We don't do any of that. We present you the evidence. You can watch what's being said, and you can make up your own mind. And I'll tell you something that people that watch the movie the first time, they don't get. The first time you watch it, it's cool, it's interesting, blah, blah, blah. The second time you watch it, you start to understand that a lot of what some of these people are saying is not true. They're not telling the truth. And then when you get to the third or fourth time that you watch it, it really starts to sink in. And that's the magic of this film. It's like onions. You're peeling away a layer every time.
How do you, like, what were some of the, is it like a poker type thing? Like there's just some telltale language and body language patterns, or was it more you were figuring out based on other testimony you were getting that this doesn't line up?
Both. I mean, for one thing, there's a rumor, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I tend to think that it is.
I love rumors.
There's a rumor that John Alexander pulled Lou Elizondo aside at the very beginning of all this and said, don't do UFO conferences because these people know the questions to ask and they're going to get you. And this was right about the time I interviewed him, and I knew the questions to ask. And there's a lot of times in this interview, like you were talking about knowing if something's harmful or not. In the interview, Lou says there's reasons for concern. Says that fear, I wouldn't go that far, but we definitely need to be concerned. And he said that. And I didn't use it in the film, but yeah, he told me that. And he said it to other places too. The reason this was going to originally be called the Elizondo tapes is because I considered there's a big gotcha in the movie around Lou. And it was friendly, and the interview continued afterwards. And it basically comes around him pretty much inadvertently admitting that there's a non-human intelligence, or at least some kind of alternative unknown intelligence that's a part of all this. And he says it, but he doesn't mean to say it. And that's where the whole title Accidental Truth comes from, was that statement. And that's why it was originally going to be the Elizondo tapes. But then as I started, because I've got a bunch of stuff, like that tape where he's talking about the isotopic ratios of metals. That was from an interview that he did in a Washington, D.C. hotel with somebody from MUFON before this whole thing really blew up. So a 45-minute tape. The section of it that I used is where he talks about the metallurgy, and he basically admits in the thing, it's like, look, it's not that these materials, we don't know what they are, because we can study metals. We know the periodic tables. Anybody can figure out what an object is. But there's isotopic ratios in these materials that just simply can't. They indicate that they cannot have been made on Earth because there's a whole science behind it. And Gary Nolan goes on to confirm that as well. The isotopic ratios of it's molecular things that have to do with the environment they're manufactured in, and like you can have titanium on Earth and it's got a certain isotopic ratio, which is a molecular configuration. You could have titanium that was manufactured somewhere else. The isotopic ratios will be different. and they cannot be changed. So in other words, you can say, okay, this is titanium manufactured. It's got a certain isotopic ratio throughout all the elements in the titanium that made it, the different metals that came together. Now, if you have a piece of titanium and it's got all the same elements, but the ratios of the isotopes are different, that indicates that it wasn't made in ways that we understand. And so Lou says that on the tape. Now, there's 2.5 minutes of this tape that I used in the film. It's a 45-minute tape. There's less than 10 minutes I used at this interview with Lou. It's a 45-minute interview. And so originally I thought I had enough material just around my Lou Elizondo material to make something pretty striking. And that got kiboshed real fast. And then so that's when I brought in all these other people. And that's when I came up, it wasn't the Elizondo tapes anymore. It was Accidental Truth. Because I got a lot of other people to kind of accidentally tell me something too.
Based on how you're talking about Lou now, after the fact and after the documentary's even out, you may have said this, but the first question would be, have some of those same people who represented him reached out since the doc came out? I can't remember if you explained that. And then the other question is, do you think he would ever sit down and do an interview with you again?
A lot of the stuff I've literally been.
You're good.
A lot of the stuff, to answer your question, I've literally been demanded not to talk about. But what I will say is that Lou and I had a very good text rapport right up until right about before the movie came out and before other people stepped in. I was texting him constantly, and he was telling me how he was very supportive of the film. He hoped it did well. He was willing to do social media and a bunch of other stuff to help us. And then all of a sudden that quashed. That exchange ended.
When did that end? Film came out April 2023. When did that end?
Yeah, it was right before the film came out, right when other people stepped in to manage my access to Lou.
Okay, but you had long since obviously changed the film name and changed the focus because some of these people had already talked to you for years before that. And so now they came back in, and this time when they came in, he also went out.
Yeah.
For good. You haven't talked to him
I haven't
at all.
talked to him since. In fact, I was told not to try to reach out to him directly.
The media rep told you that?
Yeah.
Sketchy.
It's very sketchy. And I don't know what the reasons are, but everything about my relationship with Lou changed when it became about, here's what's happened to ufology. When I interviewed him in 2018, it was very, very warm. We had a fantastic conversation, and we had a good rapport ever since. But, the UFO field for a long time has been about dedicated people doing lifelong work that never really had anything to show for it except that they cared. Well, now all of a sudden there's money in UFOs, and there's sharks in the water, and the water's getting bloody. And there are people who will stop at nothing to get their share of it, and there are people who stop at nothing to keep their share of it. And so what's happening is you've already got a field that is already baked in disinformation and secrecy and treachery, and now there's money in it too. And what you're seeing happen is a war over not only the truth in ufology, but there's a war over the money, and there's a war over who gets to tell the story, and there's a war over who gets to be the big boy on the block. And a lot of the people that are fighting to maintain their position are people that are telling the story that's authorized to be told. And then there's other people that are telling stories that are so outrageous that nobody's going to believe them, and they're serving their purpose too. Because if you have people that are just, so tinfoil hatted out that the public rolls their eyes, then they're more likely to believe the official narrative.
Yes.
And my film Accidental Truth is not about the official narrative. It's about why the official narrative isn't true, and what the true story is. But it's also about it's not about the sensationalism that is usually the opposite end of the spectrum. It's about, hey, let's reel this in and let's prove something, and let's lay down what I consider to be as close to the authentic tale of what's happened over the last X number of years that we can make a reasonable case for. And it's a story that nobody wants told.
The reality is with anything, be it ufology, insert industry here, people got to make money. They got to make a living, right? Mm-hmm. The differences are the people who are gluttonous about it, and that's what drives them totally, and they will stab everything in the back that moves to stop their ability to make the maximum amount, versus the people who are like, yeah, I want to be compensated for my great work and I want to be respected for it, but like, I'm here to work to move forward the value of what this industry does or what this company does or something like that. When I hear about the gates around the kingdom, as you're referring to right there, I'm glad you put that into two boxes. You have the box on the one hand where it's like, well, are there people who are directly being set up here to give out specific information on behalf of what the government once released? And then are there people also who are just in here who now see dollar signs and go, ooh, I can just talk about UFOs and make a lot of money on it? You know, that's the problem is when you're dealing with something that is casted into conspiracy theory land and painted a certain way by the mass media and the general public, all it takes is a few bad apples to ruin the whole thing and basically become the definition of it. We talked about this with something a little bit earlier, but right on the head here of the actual industry itself. You know, if I'm going to talk with people on my little platform here to discuss the phenomenon and stuff, I want it to be the legit people. I want it to be the people where it's like, hey, you don't have to agree with everything they're saying. You can refute some of the evidence if you have better evidence. All for that. But these are genuine people who are trying to get to something here, who aren't just complete disinformation agents. And I'm going to add into that, by the way, some of those people who are working on behalf of the government. I understand their role. It's not like I'm sitting here ripping all of them. Are there some that maybe it's like, okay, it's very, very obvious and like you seem to be just totally full of shit? Sure. But like, I'm not saying that about Lou. I'm not saying that about Chris Mellon. You know, there's value to be had there. And I think it's the audience's job to take away what you can and try to find, you know, get your best guess at what is believable and what is not.
Well, see, it's not that I don't think that Lou or Chris either are full of shit. I think that what we're dealing with here is that at the beginning of this 2017, there was this decision made by a lot of people that we're going to roll this out, but we're going to do it with this new narrative. And again, the new narrative is whitewashes everything from the end of Blue Book all the way till the beginning of ATIP and pretends there was no official government study of this in that time. And that is ultimately where all the deception and all the lies are buried, and that's why they're whitewashing it with the new story. So when TTSA rolled out, they were going to be the vehicle for the new narrative. That's why you have all these CIA guys, you know, oh yeah, we're telling this story, and we're this vehicle that's going to do it.
And Tom DeLonge.
And I'm not sure that Tom fully understood his purpose in this, but that, in my opinion, that's what it was. And then now, and even then, but especially now, if you are a threat to that new narrative, you're not getting to any of these guys. You're not. I got to Gary Nolan, but I was one of the last people. And the interview I did with Lou was one of the only ones. And the fact that I was able to get to Chris Mellon and press him on the question, these were all anomalies. That's why this movie is an anomaly, because the information and the questions I was able to ask these people are questions they will not answer now to anybody. And so the fact that that you can go and get to these guys and ask these questions, I got very, very lucky, because you can't do that now. Now Lou does a lot of these podcasts and stuff, but he's still only saying things that are on a very tightly controlled rail, and he's going further and further. But he still knows what he can say and what he can't say. And in the film, he pretty much adhered to that. And in the interview I did with him, he adhered to it. But there were just a couple times when he slipped, because I knew what questions to ask. I wasn't trying to get him, but in the back of my mind, I wanted to get him to tell me something in as friendly a way as you could possibly do that. So if you're towing the line for the new narrative, and you know who you are, if you're towing the line for the new narrative, then you're in the club. You're in the club that gets access to the government interviews. You're in the club that gets the head guys to come and be in your movie. you're in that club. As long as you're towing the new narrative line and you're willing to cooperate with this. Oh yeah, there was nothing going on for 50 years. That's the most important thing to adhere to, is to not call attention to those periods of time when all of this was evolving.
Yeah, there's something patternistically interesting about that when you think about things outside of space, things outside of aliens that have also happened in that course of history. Like you're saying, from Project Blue Book basically to, the last decade, 2017, there wasn't anything, and that's the narrative. Look at like space exploration though too. We got to the moon in 1969. Mm-hmm. Suddenly it wasn't important to get to the moon or like go beyond that. We had the, there was supposedly there were still some trips, and you had a couple unfortunate, very sad incidents. 86 with the Challenger, 03 with, what was that? The Columbia, I want to say. Whatever that one was, where it crashed as it was coming, it like blew up as it was coming back in the atmosphere. So it's not like you didn't have space exploration, but space kind of took a back seat. It went from the race to space, hire all the ex-Nazis to get us, rockets to the moon and everything. And then, we got there and everyone chill. So it's interesting to me that there also was like a break in the action, and they're even reporting that as the official narrative in like ufology and
well, see, they say that we got warned off the moon and told just to stay put. And then there's other people that say that that there's a whole subsequent space operation, a secret space program where we have advanced technology. I can't prove any of that. I didn't want to make a film where I'm saying things that I can't show, a paper trail. If I had, hey, they're secretly launching secret space program ships off of, Diego Garcia, where nobody can see the rockets go up, and we have proof that we have bases on Mars and all this kind of thing. If I could find a shred of evidence that is as definitive as the stuff I try to present in the film to support that, then I would present it. Do I believe it? I'm not sure, because I haven't seen the evidence. I'm discerning. I'm not somebody that just wants to drink the Kool-Aid. I want to know. You're going to have to make a solid case for me. I'm not going to be like, I believe it because I want to believe it. And that's
important.
Well, it's about journalism, right? At the end of the day, it's not about just being, oh my gosh, I think this is true and it must be true, and so I'm going to make movies about it. I've never been that person, and I'm not going to do it now. And so that's why the film that I made, everything's got a reasonable amount of evidence to support it, even if it's anecdotal and even if it's circumstantial.
Well, you've brought up Dr. Gary Nolan. He's a doctor, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He's a professor of pathology. Actually.
I always err on that side. I was pretty sure that sounded right in my head, but I had to make sure. You brought him up a few times today, and you've talked a little bit about like some of the testing he's done. But one of the things you talk about in your documentary is how seemingly, according to him, he fell into this kind of by accident. And if I remember this correctly, it had to do with he was studying like cancer or something metallically.
Well, there's two things that his work led him to. One is he developed a special type of mass spectrometry. The guy's a genius.
English.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That's where you could put a piece of something into a machine and it'll tell you what it's made of.
Okay.
So he developed a very specialized version of that. The guy is quite a genius, and I think he's become rich off of some of the stuff that he's invented and patented. And
he's out of Stanford too.
Yeah,
right?
He's at Stanford. Yeah.
Okay.
So he invented a certain type of mass spectrometry, and one of the things that they were using in it was like a metal tag to give a consistent reading throughout stuff. So like you'll tag something with something so that you can use it to gauge anomalous responses by the machine. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in other words, if you have a piece of aluminum and you put it in with another sample, as long as that piece of aluminum comes out reading exactly like that piece of aluminum should read, then you can rely on the other readings because you have the piece of aluminum to gauge the exactness of the machine's
Makes
work.
sense.
So he had developed this special type of mass spectrometry that used metal tags. And he was approached, and he says, yeah, I have this machine nobody else has. And so he got the chance to study materials.
I can't remember. Did he say who approached him?
Well, he said Jacques Vallée was one of them. And Jacques has some of the
famous
stuff.
French scientist.
Yeah, he's got some of the materials from Brazil, from UFO things, possibly James Fox's, possibly other ones. That's well known. And but he also says, you know, I was approached by Jacques and others, and that's one of the biggest cool things in the movie is that I researched him, and he did an interview with Jesse Michaels where he told this guy, Jesse's a podcaster. He says he told him supposedly that he can show you some of this stuff, but I can't show you other stuff because of national security concerns. But then he went on the Lex Friedman interview, Lex Friedman show, and he said, yes, I've been given stuff by people, you know, not like the government or anybody. And so I confronted him on that. I'm like, look, in one podcast, you said you had stuff you couldn't show because of national security concerns. And then in another interview, you said you hadn't been given materials by the government. So kind of which is it? And that's, you know, that's another accidental truth moment in the film where he just kind of, you know, his response is worth the $4.99. So that's the kind of thing that you see in the movie, but it's very clear that he's been studying classified materials that are of unknown origin, and what he will tell you off camera, very candidly, it confirms that. But what we put in the movie confirms it. And then he went on to he was given brain scans of victims of the Havana syndrome.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and he was studying those, and through the course of that, he got to the point where he was able to identify certain aspects of that, and these people were being injured by artificial means, and then he kicked it back to wherever he got it.
What did he discuss? I don't know as much about that. So, did he discuss about whether or not the findings conclude that it could be human-made versus something that maybe is not?
Nothing with the Havana syndrome that although they don't understand the technology that's causing this.
Yeah.
But I believe from what he told me, and it's not in the film, so I don't remember every aspect of it, but he said that he was able to determine that yes, there was something happening to these people, and across these different specimens and MRIs, there was something consistent that had in common. And at that point, he's done. He's done his research work. He's returned his reports to whoever gave him the stuff to look into. But at the same time, he was applying some of these same readings to people like experiencers and remote viewers. And people
experiencers are people who like got abducted
supposedly
and stuff.
had some kind of encounter with a non-human intelligence. That whole phraseology kind of has to expand at this point. And we could talk about that if you want. But
sure.
He found an anomaly in the brains of people that have heightened psychic abilities. Our remote viewers have had these kind of experiences where there's a part of the brain called the basal ganglia that has heightened activity. And what he found is that when he did more research into what the basal ganglia is, it's long been associated with heightened perception, heightened awareness, and intuition and things like that. And now he's got scientific evidence that people that are having these experiences have this heightened activity in this part of the brain. So in some cases, it's more developed. So that's the whole last third of the movie is talking about how we now have actual evidence that people that are having certain experiences have a slightly different brain physiology than people that aren't. And he's found that these people are... they tend to seek each other out. They tend to find each other, and like you'll find couples that both have the same thing going on with their brains, and that it is almost like a whole other classification of Homo sapien that has this level and this type of brain, and that he thinks and that there's all kinds of different methods of communication, all kinds of different methods of information transfer. And this is all what the last part of the movie is about, is how this all interacts with consciousness that we don't know about, but that our evolution has learned to latch onto. And so this thing that he's discovered in the basal ganglia of the brain among certain people that have certain abilities and experiences in common is indicating to us that our physiology is adapting to stuff that we're not aware of, on a scientific basis.
No, I was thinking, as you were saying this, the thing that's blowing my mind is I hadn't thought about that in the context of like some of the non-alien stuff. Mm-hmm. Like now my head may be going way above my pay grade thinking about this, but
we're way above our pay grade.
Yeah, I mean, fuck,
we need Michio Kaku back.
I know. I've got to get him back down here. But like thinking about, like, let's use the Havana syndrome example, because there's been, there's people that try to claim like, oh no, it's in their heads or whatever. But I've been trying to get this one fucking guy in here for 16 months now. I started emailing him like March 2022, and I've never heard a word back. So if someone has an in to him, this guy Mark Polymeropoulos, he was a CIA agent who very high up, who apparently has severe Havana syndrome. And he's been on some other podcasts talking about it. Actually, shit, he was on Sean Ryan. I could ask Sean for that. Fuck, I just figured that out. Anyway, but maybe we'll get him in here. Like, I hear guys like that talk, and instantly when it's a CIA guy, some people say, like, oh, it could be a government disinformation agent. But, like, I believe him when I hear him talking about this. And I also hear some of the evidence where people try to say that, like, oh, it's just a heightened sense of awareness and paranoia that exists in people. And I go, well, that could be true too, but when you hear the level of some of these symptoms and the lengths the government has gone to like ignore it or like cover it up or not even in Mark's case, like for a long time provide the right health care for him to get treated on it, I start to go, well, maybe this is like instantly they'll say like, oh, China, Russia, whatever, and just go to the regular culprits. Maybe it's something that is, for lack of a better way of putting it, extraterrestrial, so to speak. And I don't mean that by like aliens. Maybe it is like a different vibrating frequency in like the multiverse, and which I may be misreading some of what you said, but that's where my head was going to with what Gary was talking about with this.
Yeah. So we talked briefly about it. I didn't put it in the film because the Havana syndrome doesn't have anything to do with, the other stuff. Yeah. But basically the way he summed it up to me, as best as I can remember, is that yes, I was given all of these MRIs in this brain scan technology. I was able to find things that correlated, and I was able to identify that yes, this was an injury to these people. And so at that point, he said, I didn't study it any further. I don't know who's doing it or where it came from, but that was a different framework than what he discovered with the basal ganglia in people. It was two different things. And so he started to find these anomalies among certain people, and it was about the same time he was doing the Havana stuff. So he was able to kind of correlate different things going on in the brains of different people. And that's when he stumbled on he literally stumbled on it. The basal ganglia research, it was something that he found by accident. But he was also able to validate the Havana syndrome stuff, that it is something that is, it's a common, it's similar in all of the people that were studied, and it is something that was affected by external forces.
That's a whole, I have to do a podcast on that. I know that's like a separate thing, but I'm just so fascinated by that because that could happen to technically anyone. Like there's, it's not just like some warfare among like agents and stuff. Like it has happened to citizens.
Well, I mean, the idea that we don't have something that I could point at you right now and affect your brain in any number of ways is I'm sure we have that by now.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they're not using it in warfare right now. I mean, why attack a trench with bombs when you could just aim a beam at them and make them go crazy? We have that stuff.
We live in a world where that on the wall right there, that picture of the nuke going off, is what we think about as like the thing that all these countries have that could end it. But like there's far more invisible, simpler ways that they could do that on a way higher level at a more effective kill rate that exists in the palms of the hands of humanity right now. Biological warfare, microwave warfare, if that is the case. It just, I keep saying this on podcasts, but every day it feels more true. It's like society seems more and more fragile at all times.
Well, John Alexander, one of the things that's well known about him is that he headed up a program for the Army looking into non-lethal weapons technology. Okay. And on the surface, you think, well, what does that mean? Oh, rubber bullets, right? Or electricity, whatever. But during one of our interviews, he said something about how he was down in Brazil working with shamans while he was involved in the non-lethal weapons technology research. And that went over my head, and I didn't follow up. But then when Chris O'Brien, I don't know if you know who Chris is, he's one who's considered one of the definitive experts on cattle mutilations. He's written a bunch of books. But him and I have made several movies together, so he helped me with Accidental Truth. He's helped James, too, on The Phenomenon and on Moment of Contact. But when Chris was reviewing the footage, he's like, do you understand what this guy just said when he said that? And I'm like, no, what do you mean? He's like, he's with shamans in South America studying non-lethal weapons technologies. Alexander's background, there's pictures, a lot of stuff with, like black magic and all kinds of esoteric stuff. This guy's in non-lethal weapons research, looking at literally casting spells and etheric stuff. and so I asked about that. He's like, yeah, it's I wasn't looking at rubber bullets, dude. I mean, these guys are looking at ways to control energy that we don't see and affect people's souls and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. This is the kind of stuff they were looking into.
What if they have it and they're already doing it?
It's quite
they've
possible.
They've done it to you and me.
Yeah. Well, at least we're lucky enough to not know it.
I guess, ignorance is bliss.
We get to have this crazy illusion that we're making the movie we want to make, or we're living the life we want to live. I think it's better than being locked up in a gulag in China.
Yes. Hey, I'm with you. I am with you there. You got to look. What is it? The glass half full?
Yeah.
That's what you got to do.
I mean, I wake up every day and at least I have the illusion that I'm doing what I want to do. And I have a lot to be grateful for in the life that I live.
Well, you know what? You said something in the car earlier, just making me think of it now.
Oh,
Because
man.
the illusion of doing what I want to do. This blew my mind.
Okay, the rabbit hole is about to get deeper.
Yes, let's go right down it. That's why I'm bringing it up. You were saying to me, how did you put it? Where you were asking me about like this podcast or something, like, do I ever feel like I'm a passenger or something like that?
Well, yeah, because so this is what started the conversation, and I honestly, there's 7 billion people on the planet. I don't know who I would say this to.
8 now. Yeah.
But for some reason, I just brought it up. You have a very disarming quality about you, and also since we're going to do this show, I was like, well, let's dig into some philosophical stuff. So I just wanted to mention it to you, but. There's been so many times in my life where I've done something that could be considered a significant accomplishment. And I remember having done it, but I don't really remember the process of actually getting it done. I can stand back and I can look at something I did and it's like, wow, where did that come from? And a lot of times I'll be doing something like building a new studio or writing a book, or like even when I sit down to do an edit session, it's almost like I'm on autopilot. And I got to the point where I'm questioning, am I driving this car or am I in the passenger seat watching it being driven? And that brings up this whole question of, do we have free will or an illusion of free will? And is this reality that we're in, are we on a tram half of the time, like a ride at Disneyland, or are we really in the driver's seat in our own experience? And I've really started to question that, and I've got some theories about that are very interesting.
Share. Now's the time.
I shared them with you before, but if the universe works as a simulation, a program. And people say, hold on, stop right there, dude. We're not plugged into a matrix. But let's look at this for just a second.
Could be.
This table, right? Okay, now most of science will agree at this point that this table is not really here. This is energy vibrating at a certain frequency to give us the illusion of solid matter. Okay, this is not far-fetched stuff. This is something that Dr. Cochran would sit here and go, yeah, that's what we've determined. Yes. So we could determine that. So that means matter is an illusion. So that means everything around us is literally an illusion. I personally think that our brains are wired to interpret these electromagnetic energy patterns and render them like a computer would into real stuff that we can interact with. But let's just go back to the basics of this isn't really here. It's an illusion. Then let's look at what runs the universe. It's very simple mathematics. It's the Fibonacci sequence. It's pi. You find that the things that make things work within this universe, within physical reality, are based on just 2 or 3 very simple mathematical formulas in repeating sequences that give us the shapes, that give us the way things work, that give us the way gravity works, blah, 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 right? So what is that? Well, that's a program. It's mathematical algorithms creating a result.
Zeros and ones.
So we have an illusionary reality. We have an entire system that is run on code. Well, what is that besides a simulation? So even with what we know about the way the universe works, and we can say science pretty much agrees that this is true, there's no way around the fact that is very comparable to the very simulations that we're creating. A computer game works the exact same way. There's illusionary matter. We don't see it until we turn to it. We don't walk on the ground until we move forward. We don't hear it until we take an action that hits it. It doesn't render for us until we're right in the middle of it. So like right now, I'm seeing this table within what I can touch, within what I can see and what I can smell. But who's to say that there's anything outside that door right now? Because until I walk out there, it's not necessary for it to be created in front of me. Just like in a computer game, until you walk into the door of that computer room, it's nothing but numbers and patterns that are ready to be popped into reality for us to interpret.
Do you think, though, that if you walked out of here right now, you're a good guy, I don't think you'd do this, but if you walked out of here right now and you just found the first person on the street and killed him, do you think that what we're saying then means that that's a part of a simulation that we don't control, and therefore is that even evil that you did? It's an evil act that you did that, but are you evil for doing it, or were you programmed to do that?
Well, see, this is where we're not quite connecting, because the idea that we're in a simulation doesn't mean that we're Sims that are being controlled. I think that because if what you said, that would be like some outside force says, "Oh, let's make the little guy down there do this," and maybe that happens.
Grand Theft Auto. Yeah.
But one time I was playing that game, and I walked out and almost ran over an old lady for points, and that's when I decided I wasn't. I think I'm done with the video games. That was it for me.
Oh, the shit people admit in here. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, literally, man, it took me a minute. And that's a true story. It scared the shit out of me.
Oh, my God.
But see, the reason I brought up the nature reality is because if it truly is, and this is how it ties into free will or the illusion of free will. And there's guys out there a lot smarter than me. They're going to listen to all this and go, put that guy back in whatever box he came out. But maybe not.
Maybe not. Might be
Elon Musk didn't know anything about rockets till he read a book.
That's true. You got to start somewhere, man.
But if you can acknowledge that the universe and physical reality and matter and everything is basically a simulation run by algorithms, which is pretty reasonable based on even what we know about science now, then how can you possibly have a mathematics-based simulation that stays cohesive when there's 8 billion variations all running randomly? So in other words, how can the program contain cohesive reality if every one of us is just this sporadic random thing that's doing anything and everything at any time, and the system has to respond to that and still keep water blue and sky in the air and clouds? The mathematics of that are almost impossible to comprehend. So, and how would it work? So my theory about free will and the illusion of free will is that we are, sentient creatures with our own allocation of spiritual energy that we are in control of. But as we meander through this simulation, there's certain key points where we make decisions that affect where we're going to go next. Like, are you going to marry her? Are you going to run away at the wedding? Are you going to give up that alcohol? Or are you going to die an alcoholic? Are you going to become a drug addict? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? You're going to go to college? You're going to join the military? These are all key points in our life where we make a decision that radically affects our trajectory. That's where free will comes in. That's where we actually have that ability to make these decisions. But a lot of what happens after we make these decisions, I think, is part of like a predetermined, even if it's determined by formula. In other words, if A equals C, then D. If he does join the military, then he's going to have these certain experiences all the way to whatever. Not that every life is pre-written, but that it narrows down the possibilities and what you're going to do. So a lot of times, sometimes you're making a free will decision, but then sometimes you're on the ride that comes from making that decision. And every single thing that you do is not always free will. Sometimes you're the passenger in the car based on the decision that you made. And it's the only way that it makes sense for me for the whole algorithm of reality to work.
I'm not smart enough to come up with which one, like how it works, but I do gotta admit I enjoy the conjecture of trying to make some sense of it, even if it ends up, and it definitely will, that we're like way off in multiple different ways. If there's something that happens in conversations like this with two people who are not scientists, right here, I'm highlighting that ends up being figured out in our lifetime, that is like even on the right pathway. There's something about that mystery I think would be pretty powerful to feel. That's why it's cool that we get to record this on camera, and you know, one day people can look back 200 years from now and be like, wow, they're fucking idiots over there, like they had no idea, or like, whoa, they knew like one thing by accident, you know. But when we start talking about what we get to decide and what we don't, that's where I start to get stressed, because I'm like, you know, I think of my life as
you're in charge.
Not just that, like, yes, 100%. But also in what I'm in charge, you know, I'm a human. I make mistakes, but I'm always trying to do right. I'm always, I don't like when people are pissed at me. I don't like when I do something that then affects someone else in a negative way.
See, that's a free will decision that you made.
Exactly.
Yeah, not necessarily an action decision, but a character decision.
Yes.
So you're living the life that results from having made that decision. If you were a guy who at the core of your being made the decision that, hey, I don't care, I just want to see how many people I can piss off and how many viewers I can get and how much, you know, controversy I can create, and I don't care if people like me and I don't care if I'm honest. Well, then you'd be living a completely different life based on that decision.
But do you think that those decisions, and I think it was Jesse Itzler said one time, like there's like 30 to 50,000 decision points a human being makes a day, which is crazy to think about. And they all use a different level of brain waves, or however they explain it. But do you think that each decision that is made, which forms a decision tree, which means there are numbers we can't concept?
Well, see, I think that there's things that we think are decisions on a lower level, like are we going to grab the Diet Coke or the Diet Sprite? That we think we're making that decision, but we're just living that decision because it's not that important. And if there's different frequencies that affect different decisions in the brain, then maybe these decisions are being fed to us through these different frequencies, and they're being reacted to based on what frequency that decision is. Right. It's either an order or a decision, but we think it's a decision even though it's an order.
Bookmark that for a second. That's like you just like ordered another pizza right there. But okay. That aside, pretend for the sake of argument that most of these things actually are our decision.
Okay.
In air quotes. Every time we do one of those, could it be that there are trillions of vibrations of a similar universe where we make that decision in a slightly different way that then affects everything afterwards? So right now I exist in unlimited, infinite universes as a totally different person in a totally different environment, where the butterfly effect since the beginning of time, wherever that is, affects us to the point that they all are completely different worlds, yet somehow they may be similar.
Well, see, you know, that's a multiverse thing.
Yes.
And then there's also a scientist named Amit Goswami who says that all of these things exist, but when we take a certain action, they exist energetically, and when we take a certain action, they collapse that into that reality. But that none of these other realities are actually happening in the same way that the reality we're perceiving is. And so, like this idea that there's one you, right? But that you are the sole guy that is you. But there's all these different possibilities, and every time you make a different decision that results in a different outcome, you're jumping into this other universe where that possibility exists. And the you that is you goes there, which is being occupied by a placeholder, until you yourself go and the real Julian goes and occupies the Julian in that reality. It gets kind of weird. But the whole point of why I'm bringing this up is because it's the kind of stuff I think about. It's the kind of stuff you think about.
Yeah.
And that's the whole the point of all of this is in making documentaries about UFOs. It's because we're thinking about the mysteries of why we're here, what we are, and what it all means. And so few of us are making that commitment to puzzle that out. And if there's anything that I would say is, you know, why is that? Why are we so content, for lack of a better word, even though hardly anybody's content? Why are people largely okay with just living in this simulation, or if that's what it is, and they very rarely even think about it? I mean, I'm spending constant time puzzling this stuff out, trying to figure out what this is, because I know it's like in the beginning of the Matrix. They said, there's something wrong with the world.
Yeah.
And there's something wrong with the world. And if I'm going to be here, I'm going to work on helping other people to understand that there's something wrong with the world. And I'm going to work on figuring it out for myself. And what is the higher purpose of all of this? And it's in religions that do it. It's everywhere. But the amount of people that aren't focused on that and that have lost sight of it, it's disturbing. But then maybe they're not even real, right? Maybe they're just non-player characters in the game.
Again, it's like, are you sitting across from me right now? Am I sitting across from you? Like,
which one of us is the real one?
Yeah, we could go off on that.
Subjective reality, consensus reality. Yeah.
The thing I say this a lot, and I'll probably say this forever, and I'll say it on podcasts all the time because I say it in my conversations with other people off camera all the time, but I always try to remind myself, and I know I fail sometimes, but I try to remind myself I've only ever lived between these 2 years.
That you know of.
Again, for the sake of argument, let's stay on. I've only ever lived between these 2 years.
I think we need a direct line to Domino's at this point.
Yes, there's literally, like, we're like the meme right now, just popping them off. But just for the sake of argument, I've lived between these 2 years in the world that I know exists right here.
Right.
And all these other people, like, we study psychology. There's science that studies patterns. We all know the anatomy of, like, human beings. But everyone reacts in the smallest ways differently or has different ways of thinking about things. And so I do my very best to not be judgmental of other people, and I think it's a big part of what can hopefully make me successful in my job as well. And so, people have different beliefs. They come from different environments. They have different motivating factors. They have different reasons for existence. And to me, the number one thing I look at with people is, are you a good person? Would I fuck with you? Are you cool? Right? Like, you're a good guy. I like that. Everything else after that is great because we're talking about it on a podcast, but most importantly, like, I enjoy your company. And so, when people aren't sitting around thinking about this stuff deeper, think of like some of the stereotypical examples. Let's say you're 45 years old with a wife and 3 kids and you're trying to put them through college and, you want to be able to have some time for yourself on the weekend to spend with family. And maybe that's what you get that time and that's what excites you and you're enjoying your life and you're not necessarily worried about it. I'm cool with that. It doesn't mean that, like, I'm not going to think about it, though. It doesn't mean that, like, I'm not going to talk about it on a podcast when I get access to people like you who think about this stuff. You know what I mean? It's not so much that I'm okay with people on a mass scale not thinking about it. I do wish more people thought about it, but on an individual basis across people, I'm not going to judge people for that. That's one place where, like, some level of ignorance is bliss is not the worst thing in the world. It's not like everyone can wake up to think about and prioritize all the same things that we do. But it doesn't make it any less stressful for me because I do think about it.
Right.
It doesn't make it any less like, wow, what is it all to me? And I get, through conversations like this on air and off air, I get, what's the word, like, energized from ideas people bring to the table. Like some of the things you've said today, now I'm gonna fucking think about all that. And it's like, it does all somehow come back to the core meaning of, well, what is the meaning of all of it, pun intended.
Yeah.
And so I do think about, like, what is God? What is that? Obviously Einstein thought about it.
And
he was a lot
we
smarter
wouldn't have
than me.
religion if lots of people weren't thinking about
Yes.
it. And so the way people approach it in their own life has a lot to do with how they're dealing with reality, and also it has a lot to do with their own inner journey that's none of our business.
Yes.
And so we can't go out and blanketly say, well, people aren't paying attention to that stuff, because we don't know that.
Yeah.
And to judge them for that, I've learned it's been very hard for me to draw the line between what is judgment and what is observation. And I realize there's nothing wrong with observation. Like, if we went out last night and you went on a bender and couldn't show up, well, I'd say, that guy drinks too much and it's messing up the way he's doing things. That's not a judgment. That's an observation. If I say, well, that guy's drinking too much, he's messing up what he's doing things, and that makes him this, that is judgment. But just observation, there's nothing wrong with observing, and people have a hard time understanding that it's two different things. You can Jeffrey Dahmer liked to eat people. Okay, that's an observation.
Yes.
Jeffrey Dahmer liked to eat people, but so he's evil. That's a judgment.
Yes.
So there's nothing wrong with observing and even saying what you observed. That is not judgment. And so you're not judgmental because of that. You're observant because of that.
Yeah.
And so
That's an important distinction.
It's an important distinction that I don't think a lot of people get, which that's a judgment.
Right around the circle, man.
I know, it's crazy.
No, but you bring up the religion point in there a little bit. We haven't really talked about this today. We talked about it with Congressman Tim Burchett.
Yeah, Tim Burchett. Yeah.
Burchett, yeah, a little bit. But one of the things that really surprised me when I did the 2 podcasts with James Fox, because that was the first time on this podcast where we had delved into the phenomenon and, ufology and things like that. But I'm very active in my community and in the comment section. I love to see what people are thinking, good, bad, and indifferent. And I get a good feel for just, a sample size of what types of people are watching the content, who interacts with it. And the one thing that shocked me when I was going through a lot of the comments on those episodes is that, and I don't have to get into how I figured this out, but some of them were even blatant about it where they were saying it. But a significant number of people who interact with this content and then even looking at other content on the internet to look through comment sections and see if the patterns exist there, which they did, a significant number of people who are highly, highly interested in this content are extremely religious. And to be even more frank about it, extremely, seemingly Christian religious. And I would have never expected that because, you look at the Bible and stuff and like it's supposed to be like God, Son of Man, Jesus, like all this. And there's no room. There's like, you were talking about this earlier with me off podcast, but like it's like angels and demons and that's it.
Right.
And there's not really the room for the aliens. But the Tim Burchett example where he's a guy who looks at the Bible as potentially having some draws to aliens. And then my little sample size looking here of commenters on the internet and seeing that a lot of people seem to think this maybe without saying it as blatantly out loud like that. That is fascinating to me because it makes me think that people, even who maybe you wouldn't give this credit to, are more open-minded than we think.
Well, there's multifacets to this. The fundamental religious belief systems versus the non-human intelligence question. So one thing that Lou Elizondo told me, and that he's told this to other people, and he said it in the show Unidentified, one of the biggest things, surprisingly, that he ran into with opposition within the Pentagon and within the Defense Department to the work that he was doing is that there was a very large contingent of people that believed that this was a demonic force, as in demons, and that we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be investigating it. We shouldn't be poking the tiger in the eye. And that was not just a little voice in the Pentagon. This was a huge group of people.
Wait, they thought the phenomenon that was being witnessed was demons?
Yes, within the military establishment, within the Pentagon, within DOD, there was a large number of people that opposed his work because they thought from a very, very fundamentalist viewpoint that we're dealing with demonic activity and that it actually affected his ability to move forward and get funding. It was one of the biggest oppositions that he said he ran into. And he said that to me. I have it. He said it on TV shows. You can find him saying it on the show Unidentified. So this is not something that I'm just making up. And then you have the other side of the spectrum where you have like Tim Burchett, who is Tim is a Christian man. He's a Republican. He's a representative for the state of Tennessee. Very, very salt of the earth, very, conservative views. But when I sat down and interviewed him, his feeling was, if you look in the Bible and you look at Ezekiel building the wheel, there's a lot of people that think that was a spaceship and that's okay. And so, there's another wing of Christianity that is okay with the idea. The Pope, the Catholic Church came out a few years ago and said, there's probably life on other planets. It's okay. It doesn't.
Wait, I didn't even know that. I should know that.
No, they made an official proclamation.
Really?
Yeah. And
fuck, I missed that.
Yeah, they did. It wasn't this Pope. It was the one before. But they acknowledged that there's probably life.
Benny did it?
Yeah, there's probably life on other planets, and that it's all right. And so we have official religion willing to entertain it. And I did a podcast on some show, and I didn't realize I was on a completely Christian fundamental channel, and the guy's like, no, it's angels and demons. We're not witnessing. There is no nuts and bolts aliens. And I'm like, dude, I will give you that there might be spiritual forces that are at play here, and I have no problem with that. But I I'm not going to say that that's to the exclusion of there being other things at play. And they were just right down that, just absolutely not. This is all, there's humans and there's angels and demons. And there's
The battle
nothing
of good
else.
and evil.
Yeah. And so I find that challenging.
Yeah.
Because I was willing to concede that part of his belief system as far as what he was seeing
Yes.
had some validity possibly. I certainly wasn't going to rule it out. But the idea that there's all kinds of things going on in this universe and we don't know any of them, very few beyond our own little planet. And to say that the spiritual answer of this biblical thing is the only answer to what we're seeing, I just thought that was sad that's and when I found out about stuff going on inside the Defense Department along those lines, I was shocked. And I talked to John Brandenburg
blows
about
my
it.
mind that happened.
Yeah, it really did. And John Brandenburg, who's a researcher who's done a lot of work about Mars, he told me the same thing. He was working under classification as a physicist for a long time, and he said, "Yeah, there's a big contingent that fundamental religion, extreme fundamental religion, is governing what we are investing our energy and our time in."
See, and I'm always very, very careful about saying this because I want to be clear. I respect people who have religion as a core part of their life. And I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 90% of people use it for all the beautiful things, and I love it. Mm-hmm. That 10% can kind of ruin it for everyone, starting every goddamn war around the world for one thing.
Yeah.
And also, then you have the people who, they're certainly allowed to believe what they believe, but then when they shut you down from even introducing something, especially when you're giving them concessions like, hey, yeah, you might be right about this, or what the fuck do I know? And they're still like, no, it's this or it's that. That's where, I try to just back off and say, okay, just leave the conversation. They're going to believe what they're going to believe. Don't let it affect you. But it does piss me off sometimes because I'm like, what do you know?
Right.
Have you been there? Did you go? Were you there for the Big Bang?
Everybody can say that. And but I think the key to all the religions is at least you're acknowledging, a fundamental spiritual aspect to who and what you are. But so am I.
Yes.
And just because I'm not going to drink the Kool-Aid that you're giving me with exactly what you're telling me it has to be, and there's no other way, I can't do that. I'm on my own journey. I can't take your word for anything. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with what you're telling me. It's just that I'm going to make up my own mind. And it doesn't mean that it's really frustrating when you're a good person and you have somebody who professes that they're a good person telling you what a bad person you are.
Yes.
It's like, give me a break.
Yeah. I mean, exception to the rule. I want to highlight that. Like, I do view that as more of an exception. It is frustrating when you run into it, though. I share your opinion completely there. But like in doing all this, and you said you started working on this in 2007. You were interested in it long before that. It does, as we've said, I don't know, 10 times now, it does come back to meaning of life type things when you're talking about extraterrestrial life and stuff like that. But like, do you personally, like, what are your thoughts on where it all begins? Do you believe in a God, or what? Are you unsure?
Well, there's a lot of definitions of what God is, right?
Yes.
That is it some dude sitting on a throne, ruling over everybody? It's like, oh, here, have a lightning strike. I don't know. I think that there is certainly a conscious force that might be self-aware of its own larger scale, but is that the same exact thing that we define as God? Or is it this kind of collective energy of, who knows, like a sea of love that was everything before there was anything? I mean, obviously, the contemporary thinking, even among scientists, is that physical reality springs from consciousness, not the other way around. And we explore that in the movie. If consciousness sprang from reality, then that would mean that physical reality is the root of existence. And we're finding out scientifically that that's not the case. And the most ancient religions teach us the same thing. All of them, even biblical religion, teaches us that this world is an illusion. And it's stated very clearly. So if consciousness doesn't spring forth from this world, then it springs forth from somewhere, which is this sea of conscious energy. If you want to call that God, you can call that God. I call it God sometimes. I'm not saying, I'm just not sure that there's, like we're getting so much attention that, can you imagine if every aspect of our lives, and it goes back to whether we're making conscious decisions or not. How much supervision would it take to supervise whether you're going to buy a Sprite or a Diet Coke? And keep that under consideration and keep tabs of it, so that we can sentence you to hell when it's all over.
But you're thinking about it in terms of time and effort when that may not exist at that level of spiritual consciousness.
Well, I think consciousness, is all it is. Just like in the very beginning of the first books of the Bible, I am that I am. And so if you want to call God the sum of all conscious energy that we are all a part of, I don't think that's in any diametric opposition to what even the Bible teaches us. So do I believe that there's a God? Of course. You can't believe that you survive the life of your physical body without believing there's something else.
Do you think so? Do you have any opinions on what happens when you die? Guesses?
There seems to be a pretty good body of evidence that consciousness survives death, and that a lot of people have, these experiences that are all very similar. Through the near-death experiences, the people that come back tell very similar stories. So, do I believe that when I shut my eyes for the last time on this planet, that there's no part of me that's ever going to exist again? Not for a minute. I'm totally convinced.
I think I'm with you.
I'll tell you something. We were talking about the multiverse thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
This guy came up with this thing called quantum jumping. His name was Burt Goldman, and it's about 20 years ago that he was making the rounds with his thing, just like a metaphysical thing that you're doing. So his theory that he would say to people is that there is another version of you existing in multiple realities, which you're kind of talking about, and that these realities all exist. Now, Burt Goldman said that you can quantum jump, that through certain meditation techniques and certain mental exercises and certain visualization exercises, you can actually connect with these other versions of yourself, and you can bring something back from them. Okay?
Is this like Man in the High Castle type stuff? If you ever saw that?
Yeah, kind of.
Read that?
Yeah.
Okay.
But he's saying that you can do it for real. And he pointed to the fact that he was not a painter, and he started using this technique, and all of a sudden he could paint, because there was another version of him that could paint. So about the time when the pandemic hit...
Come on, 12-inch dick, let's go.
That's quantum jumping on steroids. Damn, it works.
Come on, grow.
Shit.
I'm sorry. I couldn't let that one go.
Damn, and I was using it for something else. If that worked, we just have a... Who cares about painting?
That was good.
Yeah, that was
Anyway, quantum jumping, you were
All
talking
right,
about the painter. Stick with the
so
less
this guy
sexual
said
example.
that he was able to come back from another reality with some of the talent from his other version of himself. And I've thought that was kind of interesting. When the pandemic hit, when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a rock star. I was all about music. And then my instruments got ripped off. I ended up having to leave home at a young age, and the whole thing got sidetracked. But during the pandemic, I picked the guitar back up and decided to start doing it. Well, I've been playing this quantum jumping thing. I've been doing some of the exercises, okay? In less than 2 years, I've gone from barely being able to play the guitar. I believe that there's another version of myself that made a go of music, and I've been trying to tap into that. And the progress I've made is off the charts. I'm getting ready to go out as a professional singer. I'm in a band that is being formed, and I'm getting ready to cut an album at 60.
Where the fuck do you have time for this? This is amazing.
Well, when I finished the movie, I decided to spend some time on music. So,
wow.
But I've been actually doing these exercises, and sometimes, like, I've got a singing coach, and she'll come over and we'll be doing stuff, and she's like, "It should have taken you 6 months to get to that point. You did it in a week." And this is happening. It's happening to me right now, and I'm doing those experiments with connecting with yourself. I don't know if it works, but I've made a conscious effort to get in touch with this other part of me, and I'm getting better, because at my age, not doing music your whole life,
oh, it's hard.
You have to be able to. You're either going to have to make miraculous progress or give it up. and I'm making some pretty serious progress.
That could be. I wonder if that's like a serious self-belief based on believing in that this could exist, or if it's a combination of both. But either way, that's pretty trippy.
Yeah.
Quantum jumping.
Quantum jumping. I'm not saying that it works.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
saying
yeah.
there's anything to
No,
it.
I hear you.
I'm just saying that I've, as a musician, I've made probably 10 years progress in 2 years.
And what's next for you? Are you making another documentary?
Well, I'm gonna do one. My next one's gonna be, see, the 3 topics that I've decided to cover in my career were the ET question, the life after death question, and then the nature of reality. I've got dozens of productions all around those 3 things. So the next real doc that I'm going to do is going to be about life after death, and I'm going to combine. I've done 3 ghost documentaries about ghost hunting, electronic voice phenomenon, haunted houses, walking around with cameras, and people going, "Oh, that freaked me out," that kind of stuff. So I'm going to combine that with all of the interviews I've shot with the key NDE people, Eben Alexander, Marjorie Willicott, Jeffrey Olson, just pretty much anybody that's written a bestseller about near-death experiences, I've interviewed them. And I've just been sitting on this stuff for a while. And then I'm going to combine that with everything that we're learning about consciousness, surviving death. And then the third in the series is going to be unveiling, what is the nature of reality, and are we in a simulation?
Oh, I'm so
there's
in for
3
all this.
loosely affiliated films that are going to culminate in my key documentaries. But at the same time, I'm working on an animated series about Mars and the SpaceX universe. When I did Accidental Truth,
Are you quantum jumping between the different versions of you to get all the time for this shit?
no,
Holy
I
shit.
just it's all I do.
Wow.
And it's like because I don't do anything else. I just work.
Where can people get the documentary? Amazon, Apple, everywhere?
Yeah, it's all over. Apple,
Accidental Truth.
Accidental Truth, UFO Revelations. Forgot to mention that it's narrated by Matthew Modine, who plays the Dr. Brennan in Stranger
Full Metal Jacket
Things.
guy, right?
Full Metal Jacket,
yeah.
Stranger Things, and he's coming out in the new Oppenheimer movie.
Oh, very cool. I can't wait
Get
for
this.
that.
He plays Vanover Bush in the Oppenheimer movie. Vanover Bush was supposedly a member of NJ12, the group that was put together to study the whole thing. So,
All right, well, I can't wait for that movie, too. Like, that's going to be
it's going to be really good.
Unreal. And I heard it's like 3 hours. But this, I will put the links to this in the description.
Yeah, you can go
I've
to
checked it out.
accidentaltruths.com, and that's where you can get the T-shirt if you want.
So I'll put that as well, so people can
and
get
also
the t-shirt.
rent the movie.
Very cool. But yeah, get the movie. It's highly, highly informative. You did a great job, and I really enjoyed this, man. Thank you for coming out from Arizona.
And now you got the shirt. And thanks
And now
for
I got
having
the
me
shirt.
out.
Thank you for the shirt too.
No, I'm really stoked that you brought me on, because you're reaching a whole other demographic of people than the ones that I'm going to reach through, like MUFON or any of those other things. We didn't talk about MUFON.
We talked about it a little, but we didn't go all the way there. We can talk about that next time.
We could do that next time. But there's one other thing before we wrap up. It's a question that probably the biggest question of the entire interview, and I do understand how important it is. And so let's just dive right in. What does it say on that cup right there?
Oh, do aliens drink? I don't know if they drink anything.
I spend next to the nature of my own existence, this is probably the question I spend the most time on.
Do they drink?
Yeah, I mean, I ask everybody. I asked the stewardess on the plane the other day. She cut me off.
I don't know. I've heard sometimes they have a mouth, other times they don't.
Yeah, they have a mouth. They don't. Sometimes some people think they can drink blood with their fingers, and
God.
all kinds of crazy stuff. But I think that the fact that they found our planet, at least the person flying the spaceship must have been drinking, because you wouldn't land here on purpose.
That is true. That might be true. You might be onto something there. Ron, thanks for doing it, man.
All right, man. I appreciate it.
We'll do it again.
Everybody else,
Everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a
you
thought.
know who
Get
you
back
are.
to me. Peace.